the determination of the wage rates, interest rates, for example, two interlinked markets, or the inverse relationship, size productivity relationship. These and many others. He tried to interpret in the specific context of Indian economy, particularly the institutions, many of which others took over. Amit Badri's semi-feudalism, or Krishna Bharadwaj's size productivity, many concepts, and that's something that has not been sufficiently acknowledged. That seminal ideas of Raj have been taken forward. So let's hear the presenter. I don't know what to say. Please be look forward to hearing you share and discuss it with Siddha so that you can see your outline.
Thank you, Dr. Isaac. I hope to touch on all the things you briefly mentioned already, interlinked markets and labor absorption, industry and so on.
അവിടെ പോടില്ല.
The breadth of K. N. Raj's scholarly interests and the themes explored by him in his scholarly and policy work are remarkable, as we've been hearing both yesterday and today. And the 6 themed panels of this conference suggest as much. The paper I've written revisits Raj's approach to scholarship to learn what it might offer for us today, focusing on 3 interrelated aspects: humanist vision, approach to theory and empirics, and institutional understanding of economy and society. Finally, I will also touch on what is missing in the research lines of Raj and his successors. While my focus is on Raj's intellectual legacy, he of course had many other selves, such as which colleagues and friends have written about, talked about, especially as a teacher, as an institution builder, and even as a director of plays. I'm going to start with the first of these 3 themes. I'm calling it humanist vision. Raj had a humanist moral vision, and his early career coincided with heightened expectations regarding democracy and development in post-colonial India. Just put a sprinkling of the kinds of things that people said, for example, as obituary, and even prior to his demise, the moral voice, welfare of fellow human beings, nation-building project, radical Nehruvian, combining humanitarian and economic goals. In his PhD thesis itself, published in 1948, when he was only 24, Raj brought a humanist vision to the dry technical subject of RBI functioning. He notes that the RBI had little influence on agricultural credit to the non-elite. A quarter century later, writing in 1974, Raj was still noting that banking policy focused on interest rates and total loans and was ignoring inclusivity. He was asking who gets the loans, on what poor. There is a similarity with his US contemporary Harold Laswell. Inspired by John Dewey's pragmatist philosophy, Laswell studied what he called the policy sciences of democracy by integrating scientific method and democratic humanism. Today, analyses and debates about economic growth tend to focus on growth in its own terms. They do not necessarily engage with or even concern employment and inclusion. But in the famous Cairo lectures of 1956, published in 57, Raj says that employment has, quote, the right to be regarded as an end in itself, unquote. The quote from the lectures I've put here, the ultimate objective of economic organization and activity is the advancement of human welfare. Raj viewed even technological change from the perspective of labor and employment. While technological change may displace labor in the short term, he allowed for the possibility of consequent growth that would then increase employment. But he was clear that the question is, quote, whether and under what conditions the labor so displaced will be reabsorbed, unquote. Raj was skeptical that technological change would lead to reabsorption, quote, without any conscious regulation or direction, unquote. And this makes institutions and governance integral to the analysis. But the so-called reabsorption thesis is not sufficient. We have to further investigate its implications for equality. Technological change can weigh in favor of capitalists and increase economic and political inequality. It can also increase rural-urban and spatial inequality, and even tend to a new kind of internal colonialism. In his contribution to the first five-year plan, Raj imagined meaningful, inclusive development rather than merely the increase of narrow, marketized value. And the vision was organic to existing institutional and social realities. This was in sharp contrast to the second five-year plan, and later, narrow technicization of policy and planning. We've also heard about, in the last 2 days already, about Raj's deep instinct to go beyond economic growth, as manifested in the 75 landmark study titled Poverty, Unemployment, and Development Policy, with reference to Kerala. I'll quickly move on to the second theme, theory and empirics. Raj's scholarly approach blended theory, empirics, and policy, something that was discussed quite a bit even in the immediately preceding session, and transcended several dichotomies, quantitative and qualitative, pattern and mechanism, economics and other disciplines, understanding and action, and policy formulation and implementation. He was skeptical of high theory, such as the general equilibrium analysis of Leon Walras, for what he called understanding real-world problems. I put in a quote from Vaidyanathan here about his remarkable gift of homing in on important issues to come up with interesting and often provocative explanations on propositions. Raj's approach to the place of theory in economic analysis can be described as grounded theorizing, a term which became popular considerations to understand economic phenomena. In fact, power relations also underlie interlocking of the markets of various factors, land, labor, credit, as well as produce markets. Raj emphasizes the need for economic analysis to take this reality into account. Coming to the specifics of the empirical approach, put in a quote again from Vaidyanathan, he made extensive use of data but was rather skeptical about sophisticated econometric models and techniques, especially their indiscriminate application. Although Raj was very much empirically oriented, Mexico. In a wonderful 1970 piece, Raj interrogates this through masterful empirical analysis that's worth briefly recounting here. So I'm going to get into he manages to counter this kind of argument. He begins by pointing out that the overall high growth numbers for Mexican agriculture hide major temporal and spatial variation that immediately complicate the causal inference of the role of technology. Consider temporal variation first. The average growth rate in Mexican agriculture was 6.5% in the 1940s, but only 3.7% in the 1950s. A careful study had already established that high growth in the 1940s was associated with land inequality. Further, even within the northern regions, irrigation and growth was concentrated in just 7 states. Furthermore, within the 7, growth was concentrated only in 2. Indeed, Sonora State accounted for half of Mexico's wheat production in 1961. Further, the proximity to the US the Mexican case even less generalizable. When the US imposed ceilings on cotton cultivation in the US, it benefited contiguous areas across the border, Mexico's northern regions, where US influence ensured that farmers got financial assistance and a ready market. All of this leads Raj to talk of what he calls casual empiricism. So this is a slightly longer quote. So I've taken a little bit longer with this particular piece because the way he builds the argument is really a model of how one could approach empirical analysis. So I'll just read parts of this. It's fairly clear that it was largely a kind of enclave development made possible by heavy investments in irrigation, opening up new areas for cultivation, as well as by certain special circumstances such as that of location. That the Mexican experience during this period has nevertheless been cited as a demonstration of the possibility of transforming traditional agriculture is a remarkable example of the kind of casual empiricism that is abundantly in evidence in the literature on development problems. Raj, I felt when I read this piece, and I went back and read it again a couple of times, I felt Raj was like a magician, pulling one rabbit after another from his hat to counter arguments from the likes of Schultz. And note, he was simply reinterpreting findings from already existing studies. Raj explicitly took this as a cautionary tale of casual empiricism. In this case, what today we would call the fallacy of ecological inference. Raj further notes that although at the country level agriculture growth was far lower in India than in Mexico, Punjab and Madras had much higher growth. Punjab had a colonial legacy of irrigation investment, supplemented by post-colonial investments. Further, Punjab had much smaller holdings with family labor, unlike Mexico, making Punjab's growth performance, quote, perhaps more worthy of attention than that in Mexico, unquote, according to Raj. Since Raj's day, economic and policy analysis have become even less embedded in socio-political context and process. There's far less importance given to institutional, social, and political underpinnings. And concomitantly, barefoot empiricism or footloose empirical analysis has increased. I'll move on to the third of the three themes, institutional context. In keeping with the spirit of classical political economy, Raj's approach embedded economic analysis within institutional settings. Start with social institutions. A key part of Raj's early work, the Cairo lectures and some later work on employment, was the idea of households and villages operating on social norms of economic behavior quite different from that of individualized market logic of conventional economics, and how the slow entry of markets makes individuals lose their what he called old moorings in social institutions and produces open unemployment, wage-seeking urban migrants, and landless agricultural labor. But what affected this change from old moorings or social institutional transition? Here, Raj, in the Cairo lectures, invokes still broader institutional processes, such as the breakup of joint families, coming in of individual property rights regimes and markets favored by colonial rulers, and technological change displacing labor from traditional occupations. Next, village economies and communities. Raj argues that for labor markets to increase through pull factors rather than distress-driven push factors, real incomes of rural households would need to increase. Both land reform policies, mentioned I think a few times already earlier, and household industry policies would contribute to this. From the vantage of today, Raj's argument from almost 3/4 of a century ago is striking and I believe perspicacious. It is an argument that would greatly decenter the economy and perhaps partly dismantle the economic pyramid of space-based and class-based inequalities. Following through, Raj's argument also breathes a new life and meaning to the notion of local community, which stands hollowed out in many parts of India today. In the Cairo lectures, he uses contextual economic logic to point to important productive in situ investments and creation of social assets. For example, he talks about things like digging a well, raising a fence, making it worthwhile for the household to subsist, to flourish. But he also talks about building up various social overheads, which the community considers necessary, such as the construction of village tanks, irrigation drains, school buildings, etc. There are interesting echoes with Narega and its initial emphasis on local community projects with local labor. More generally, Raj's argument is consistent with commons-oriented constructive work. Here, we see Raj's realist institutional approach and economic analysis in confluence with his decentered humanist vision. Finally, political institutions. In his overall approach, Raj incorporates political and policy institutions just as much or even more than he does social institutions. In pursuing the embeddedness of economic production, distribution, and consumption in broader institutional and political structures, Raj explores governance regimes through the concept of intermediate classes, a concept he developed from Kelesky's work. He had been thinking about it even before encountering Kelesky. Soon after Nehru's death in 1964, Raj sketches out a nuanced picture of class forces and governance. Raj notes that Nehru was aware that his own Congress party represented the petty bourgeoisie more than big business or the proletariat. To quote from the 64 paper, it was an EPW special issue, this class was nearer in its economic status to the proletariat than to big business, and therefore potentially prepared to champion the cause of the former,
which is the proletariat. However, it was conservative in its attitudes to programs and policies. The class possessed some vitality, according to him, to use its voice for the cause of the deprived against propertied interests. Raj uses this framing to interpret many policies of Nehru's government, such as regulation of large and modern industries, public sector expansion, hostility to foreign private capital, promotion of cooperatives. But it turns out that the petty bourgeoisie had, quote, more vocal power than vitality in the handling of vital problems, unquote. 9 years later, in the famous 1973 article, Raj returns to these ideas, this time explicitly invoking Kelesky's concept of intermediate regimes and provoking full-blooded rebuttals from Marxist theoreticians such as EMS, as was mentioned earlier. I will not discuss it here, as Sanjay Baru's talk will explore this in depth. Finally, so far I've tried to identify and understand Raj's scholarly approach. The approach was remarkably expansive and productive, and Raj and others have been rightly feted for it. At the same time, it also developed important blind spots, identified by later researchers. I turned to that critique in the spirit of building on Raj's own sense of openness and dialectical learning. 4 issues that I will very briefly cover: caste and gender power and subjectivities, problems with overemphasizing the state as the agent of development, fragmentation and individualist materialist orientations, and the crises signaled by environmental degradation and climate change. First, critical lenses on development. Following the CDS UN report of 75, research and discussions fueled subnational pride for developmentalist outcomes in Kerala. Further research showed that Kerala's political strategies and development trajectory excluded some groups, for instance, Dalits and Adivasis, and communities such as fishing communities. Social relations, particularly focusing on gender and caste relations, were not part of mainstream research, which stayed within the paradigm of developmentalism or development and modernization. And in the spirit of that dialectics, some quotes from Leela Gulati, who recall mainstream research reduced gender to relative measures of women's health and education, with a questionable claim that they represent, quote-unquote, women's autonomy. Second, over-focus on the state. Like many economists of his time, Raj had a state-oriented approach to social and economic change. Although, unlike many of them, he had also recognized possibilities that would strengthen what he called social organization and local community. Thus, following the CDS UN report, the research lines opened by Raj and his colleagues at the CDS emphasized state action for development. At the time, the only mainstream pushback to the emphasis on state action came from pro-market economists such as Jagdish Bhagwati. However, in Kerala, a later critique came from those like Joseph Taramangalam, who suggested that an overdeveloped state could stifle civil society. Perhaps Raj would have been sympathetic to this concern, as his enthusiasm for decentralization suggests. Third, individualist materialist orientation. The focus on the state fueled expectations of continued state action for welfare. To this was added new subjectivities from economic liberalization that produced an individualist materialist orientation. J. Devika observes that state action was, quote, largely individual beneficiary oriented and consumption centered, and produced the subject of responsibilized welfare, unquote. Raj may have foreseen to some extent the challenges posed by development strategies leading to untrammeled materialism. This is a photo I took this morning while coming into CDS. This is from LMS Palayam, right opposite the corporation building, right in the heart of the city, right, with all that greenery and blue sky. Smack in the middle is this holding, this billboard, live in a Greek hamlet with this palatial building, right? And if you look carefully, you will see the several crores which are required to live in this Greek hamlet. But consumerism-fueled individualist, materialist orientation was not as full-blown then as it is today. And yet, the successors to Raj's research lines have not followed up sufficiently on this. Finally, Raj's instinct for low-tech and decentered ways of living manifested in the architectural vision of the CDS campus and its freedoms and sociality may have made him closer to the smallest beautiful approach than most of his contemporaries. Nevertheless, as with most economists of his time, Raj did not put a special weight on environmental issues. Today, environmental and climate change concerns have attained a prominence that they did not have in his day. But it is missing in the core work of the research lines of his successors. To conclude, this paper, this talk, has explored Raj's approach to scholarship by emphasizing his humanist vision, grounded theorizing, and insistence on institutional context. While this involved some of his key arguments, the primary focus was not to address their content or to evaluate them, or even to see whether they have stood the test of time. I also do not seek to attribute any unique characteristics to Raj for this approach. Indeed, it is shared by several people who influenced Raj and were influenced by him. Rather, the purpose is to revisit the approach that they and Raj practiced as a reminder of an important pathway to knowledge creation and action. Many aspects of the approach have lost their salience in contemporary economics and parts of development thinking as well. An appreciation of Raj's scholarship can go some way towards recovering them and reapplying them to contemporary scholarship. At the same time, it is important to identify what was missed out, which I believe Raj's approach was capacious enough to allow subsequent research to reach for. That, to me, is the inspiring lesson from this survey of Raj's work. Thank you.
So good afternoon to all. I'm really honored as perhaps, oh sorry, 10 minutes, yeah. Yeah. I thought you were supposed to introduce me, no. I was just barging ahead, you know. So I'm really honored that being his oldest student, I think, here, and also one of the oldest members of the CDS community that have been asked to reminisce about Raj. And mine is more of a personal nature and a very non-economic nature, and that's why I asked for the program. Because when Isaac mentioned theory and all that, I got a little worried. Am I supposed to say anything on his theory? But I find no, it's reminiscence, and I think that's how I'm taking it. Yesterday when the alumni, they were all reminiscing about Raj and CDS and how they came to CDS, it just struck me, how did I come to CDS, you know? I had done my MA, of course, in the Delhi School of Economics in the early 60s. And then, of course, the answer was simple, because mine was a case of migration by marriage. And that's how I came to CDS, because I married a Malayali. And of course, by the time we came here in the early 70s, I'd heard that Raj had left Delhi and that he is setting up the CDS here. I think it was in a working condition in the house which is just outside the campus, the courier courses house, where we were all put in a room. But we went and, Epan and I went and met Raj. And Raj had met Dr. Epan in Delhi, because I don't know whether you all remember that Raj was very much, I think everybody must be remembering it, he was very agitated by the implementation of the three plans. And by the time the fourth plan was had already been prepared and was supposed to be launched, there was huge crisis of foreign exchange as also a crisis of food. And he was wondering how you can have a planning with these problems there, because not enough attention is being given to rural development or agriculture. And the fact that we are not able to, the industrialization process is very import intensive, and these were creating huge problems for the planning process. And the planning board in Kerala at that time, it was set up in 67, in 69 they had prepared an alternate framework for the fourth five-year plan. And Dr. Eapen had gone to Delhi to talk to Raj, because he knew Raj's discontent with the planning system, to get his support. I don't know finally what happened, whether, what happened to that alternate, it was not adopted by the central government, but certainly the union government put off planning for the 2 years, 66, 67, for the planned holidays for the planned period. So now when I reminisce about Raj, I really think of him first as a teacher, and then of course as an institution builder and as a researcher. That's how I think of him. And as a teacher, I think everybody who's been taught by him would agree that it's a sort of iconic teacher, and the way he would come to the class, the first time we saw him when he came to the class, he was sort of an inner energy which didn't show in his stride. He didn't come striding into the class quietly and with a sparkle in his eyes. You find his eyes were sparkling, and he had a dimple on his cheek. And he came to the class and started talking. First, he taught us monetary economics, and of course that was a difficult subject, we all thought, but somehow he made it quite simple. But later on, we all actually latched on to his lectures on the Indian economy, which were absolutely excellent lectures, because they showed us the connections between the different sectors in the Indian economy, how not only the sectors but also the social, economic and political dimensions were all interconnected. And that really made the lectures so interesting, which of course had a very large impact on our own work in the CDS later. My own work when I came to CDS was on the per capita decline in consumption of cotton cloth, which was very much linked to what was happening in the rural areas. So, that sort of a teaching that we learned in his classes in the Delhi school were really something which helped us then to come back or to do research anywhere. I happened to come back to Kerala and happened to be in his institution, and so it was definitely a much better opportunity for me to be able to do the type of research which Raj had been really talking about. And if you now, coming to center, CDS, after in the early 70s, when we came to Kerala, Trivandrum, we went and met him, and immediately Raj said, "You please join the center, because we are going to do the study on the UN, the poverty study." And I think the next year there were notifications for recruitment, and I got selected in that. And so that is how I joined the CDS, formally in 73, but was there in 72 working on the UN report. Now, what struck one, when one was in the CDS, was the way Raj and that peer group, that peer group of 4 or 5 towering economists who came along to set up the CDS, T.N. Krishnan, they've already been mentioned. I mean, that sort of created an ambience of a sort of work, methods and practices which were so committed, so honest, and what we call, ethical. And now we're talking about research ethics and integrity in research. That was part of the ambience of CDS, that it's not that anyone taught us about research ethics or taught us about integrity in research. It was the way they themselves worked and helped us to do our research work. That is what really had the impact on us in terms of making us very honest and committed to research and trying to do research which has some social relevance. So that is one thing which I really want to emphasize. Raj as an institution builder, the way they created an environment which was in a way free and flexible. You could really work on any subject that you wanted. Of course, they helped you initially. People like me who had just gone there, they suggested that, look, why don't you do this area, because it's very interesting. Why is it happening in a country where you've had 3 plans with a high rate of growth, and you still have a declining per capita cotton cloth consumption. And unlike that, so many others were also helped in choosing their areas of work. But the point was that we had this freedom and the flexibility to work on whatever we wanted to work. And people say, wasn't it taken, and of course one thing I mentioned it before, we never had to sign any registers. The academic staff were not signing any registers because Raj was very firm that research is not a 9-to-5 job. You can't be thinking about it any time of the day or any time of the night, and so there's no need for the academic staff to sign the registers. And people ask, didn't people take advantage of it? And I always say that there was a very self-correcting mechanism. If I don't produce anything for the last 3 years, I'm shamed. I mean, there are others who are producing 3 or 4 papers, and here am I doing nothing. There's a self-correcting mechanism in this whole thing. Plus, there were checks and balances. I'm not saying everything was left free like that. There were 2 or 3 years, you had annual reviews, how you are doing and what have you produced, and that determined our promotion or determined our next increment. So there were checks and balances, but more or less the environment was one of freedom and flexibility, and you could do whatever you want. So there's one aspect of him as an institution builder which I really wanted to emphasize, the whole issue of research ethics. I mean, no fudging of data, nothing, you get the data, you see what it shows, and try to say what is showing. There's no question of being dishonest in it. The second thing which I wanted to say was, given his great fascination for decentralized governance, what really helped the center, and I think that's probably the most important reason for its sustainability, is he decentralized governance in the center. I was trying to think which year did it happen. Was it the late 70s or early 80s? Anyway, somewhere around the early 80s, we were suddenly told that there are 5 or 6 committees have been formed in the center. And we were a small group at that time, so each one of us was involved. So there was an academic committee, there was a library committee, there was a finance committee, there was a staff welfare committee, and there was something else also, the seminar committee. So these were the 4 or 5 committees which were set up, and each one of us had a role in it. And even if one didn't get a role initially, 1 or 2 years later, it evolved. So all of us felt as if we are actually part of the management of the CDS. And I think that played a very important role in its sustainability. The research integrity and the fact that it really involved you in its functioning. Later, the MPhil committees, PhD committees came later. All this really involved almost everybody in the thing. So I do think that these things played very important role in Raj as an institution builder. And later, when I was working on gender, and then I was wondering how come I didn't see anything by what Suraj has now described as one of the limitations or the critiques of Raj. I saw nothing on women, I thought. How come there's nothing on women and men, or was transgenders come much later? But then it was very interesting to see there was one write-up on Raj, I think it was Kannan's, I'm not remembering, where he pointed out that for Raj, in an agrarian household, everyone in the household was a worker. That no woman was not a worker in that household because the production unit was a household unit. And I thought that was a very radical thinking at that time. And later, all this whole thing about the census not enumerating household, women who are working in the household and who will be left out of the enumeration. Of course, it's petty subsistence work, I know that, but at least they were counted as workers by Raj. And he would, of course, argued for improving the conditions of production so that these households do much better. So, yeah, I'm stopping. I'm really stopping because talking about Raj also makes one so emotional, and I don't want to, start doing that now. So I really think that he's somebody whom one can never forget, and I'm so happy to have had the opportunity of him as my teacher, as also as a builder of an institution. I worked for 30 years of my life. Thank you so much.
That leaves us 5 minutes for rapid fire questions to Dr. Suraj.
You said 10 or 20?
Yeah, then we have some time for raising questions. Dr. Suraj is here. I'll kick off with one question. So you describe the elements of Raj's work: humanist vision, grounded theory, and institutional context. Why did you leave out the policy orientation of all his works? That's something very important part of almost all the works. How to change the institutional context. Of course, the agency was the state that you mentioned, but don't you think it's very important enough to have a discussion of that?
Rapid fire, I'm told. So it was with trepidation that I prepared for this, because many of you know his work a lot. All I can claim is in the last few months, from his PhD thesis onwards, I read every scrap that I could lay my hands on. And so I wrote a longish paper, and this is just a small part of it. So his approach to policy was integral. So that second section that I presented, which I call theory and empirics, actually in the paper it's theory, empirics, and policy, inseparably so. And as early as his 1971 decentralization paper, CDS's first working paper, when Raj imagined in that paper decentralization, he immediately thinks both in terms of center state and state-local relations. In other words, both federalism and decentralization, as we understand today, is part of that. And there he makes a very fundamental point, going to Dr. Isaac's question, which is he says that the planning machinery, and this was mentioned, I think, by V.K. Ramachandran, somebody in the inaugural session, that the planning machinery that we set up in Delhi has not been replicated at the state level in any meaningful manner. Right? And then, of course, he's talking about district-level planning, and from the CDS, a whole bunch of CDS faculty wrote an important working paper in 1980 about district-level planning. So I think, as I understand it, it was very much there, and in the paper, I put it in that second section. So I presented only theory and empirics, but I absolutely agree. I think it's inseparable from policy. And he had a lot to say about policy formulation versus implementation. So now the term policy, just like there is casual empiricism, there is a casual approach to policy, where when people use the word policy, what they actually mean is policy intent, not the entire policy process, which can be highly nonlinear. And I think he had interesting things to say about elements of what today we call policy process, though the literature didn't exist back then. So very much so, yeah. For reasons of time, I omitted it.
So, Dr. Suraj, what stood out, I think, from your paper is with respect to... What stood up possibly in the course of your presentation was with respect to this issue relating to how the same data, when interpreted in a different way, can yield a totally different result from what you had given as an example of that Mexico's agricultural study by Professor K. Raj. At another part which I thought, that is, other than keeping on repeating about the Slater surveys which are done in colleges long back, how effectively have we been able to integrate such sort of surveys as a way of socially embedding back economics as a discipline in colleges? I think as members of the research community as well as academic community, we would do well to ponder over it. To add to Professor Thomas Isaac's query with respect to policy, I think that comes as part of your larger essay, as you had told me before, that a person who worked on the first balance of payment sheet of the country, the first person who creatively contributed to the first 5-year plan, through his innings in the first as well as part of the second 5-year plan, when he thinks that scarcity of foreign exchange is an important consideration of a developing country, he further goes and models that along with Amartya Sen in Oxford Economic Papers, which means number of years, a decade of creative activity in the policy sphere, later transforming itself into a proper model, which you have already told is occurring in your longer paper. That is in fact something which is very distinct. That is, you are deriving macroeconomic models from the policy experience and its pitfalls you've come across. I think I should reserve my comments here, and you could.
I think I've been asked to briefly respond, but I'll be brief. I think the point about I also like the Mexico thing, because there's a certain way in which he lays it out. It's very reader friendly. But if you his famous 1976 paper on industrial stagnation, which is also I think mentioned before, that also has an interesting 1 or 2 page detour into how to measure industrial capacity and how measures suggested by USAID and later FICCI in the 60s and then 70s drove Indian policy, and then he asked very basic questions of how it's been calculated. And when you read it, you're convinced, right? So time and again he does this. There is a certain going back to, so I agree with you. About village studies, I think this is a big, I mean, the extent of longitudinal and spatial variation, even in small spaces in India. Jan Brahman, many people have commented on this, but what do we do, right? What does that mean for frameworks, for policy? It's a big one. I'll just acknowledge that as an important question.
I think Mridul's point of creating an liberal academic environment in CDS, I think it's very, very important. But I just want to highlight that somehow we miss a related point. The related point is Kendra's ability to negotiate with governments to facilitate, create that enabling environment, whether it is in terms of resources and governance. Usually it's very difficult for leaders of organizations to negotiate with government to get that autonomy. I think that we felt over a period of time. I joined CDS as a faculty only in 1996. Later on, we felt the importance of that. The leaders' capability to negotiate with governments to facilitate that autonomy for academics, and that's something which we need to think a lot more about.
I think that's actually a wonderful point, Shanta Kumar, because there were so many instances where Raj would just put his foot down. And this signing of the register was one of them. Till now, I was told, I asked Veeraman, he said no, they don't. But there was a big hue and cry in the government that nobody should be allowed not to sign the register. But he just put his foot down. I can't remember the other instances. 2 or 3 instances like this, he just used to put his foot down. And the government had to agree. And of course, it was a sensitive government which agreed to it. So I'm very happy you.
We have time for one more question.
So I just wanted to ask, I just want to raise this question about Raj's, the connection, the connection of Raj's work, early work with economic nationalism in general. So if you look at, say, for example, and also the question of the connections between Raj's concerns, early concerns with those of B.R. Ambedkar as an economist. So it's interesting that both of them, are interested primarily in monetary policy to start with. And then, and it's interesting why that topic becomes, of great interest to nationalist economists. Of course, as you rightly pointed out at a later, in your critique, very clearly the question of caste and gender really fell out of that frame. They were not in the frame. But it's interesting that early on, whether even an economist, when Ambedkar was training to be an economist, the interest was definitely in questions like monetary policy. So what does it speak about economic nationalism, and how can it shape the lenses of even someone like, Dr. Ambedkar?
Devika, let's talk about it separate. This is wonderful, but I don't want to waste time speculating. I think it's a lovely question to ask. Well, Ambedkar himself got his due only much later, right? Not in Raj's heyday. So, but yeah, there are parallels. But
You know, it's very interesting why we don't see caste, because Raj was so conscious of the fact, and I think I remember his argument with EMS saying that caste is going to be the problem. So I'm just wondering, why have you missed out something from his writings that he didn't write about? You remember that when Joan Robinson, she was the one who pointed out the caste thing, and Raj was also very clear on this, that it's really a very big, great limitation which the Marxist party is not realizing. And big arguments used to happen on this. So I'm really surprised why it didn't sort of come into his writings, you know.
On this, the famous 1976 paper on village economies, from which the Slater villages were restudied, he brings up the issue of village serfs and bonded labor, but he does not bring in the caste issue. He talks about Brahmins, Naidus, Naikars. So there is, we've had some discussions, Tyagu and I, on that particular paper. And what is it? So he recognizes it, but he doesn't name the caste. I don't know, maybe there's some unearthing to do here. But there's clearly a sense of caste in his understanding of those village restudies. It's very clear. He talks about which caste owns what, but perhaps there is something, and this is a little anachronistic, right? We can't go back. But I think in the light of what we know today, we might reinterpret it differently.
Thank you, Isaac. You know, I don't have a question, I have a suggestion. Excellent talk. 2 years back, I called Gopal Raj and I said, I want to write a biography of K.N. Raj. Can I get access to all his papers? And Gopal said, yes, come down to Trivandrum. And for the last 2 years, I've not been able to do that. I'm finally here. And listening to you and reading some of what you've published, I think you're the right person to write the biography of K.N. Raj. My comment on your presentation, in the light of what Mridul also said about the crisis in planning, is that there is, if you like, you know, we talk about early Marx, late Marx, there's an early Raj and a late Raj. And the turning point is the late 60s. The balance of payments crisis, the arguments with Jagdish Bhagwati on trade policy, industrial policy, exchange rate policy, is falling out with Indira Gandhi, and his decision to move to Kerala. All of this is happening in a very short period of time, right? His critique of the planning process, which Mridul referred to. It is also the period when all his peers and friends are leaving India and going abroad. Amartya Sen went abroad, Bhagwati went abroad, T.N. Srinivasan went abroad, a whole lot of people from Delhi school. And he was making a deliberate point coming to Kerala and then attracting Vaidyanathan and Krishnan. And so in the field of economics, something interesting is happening, which sustains over the next 30, 40 years. There's an out-migration of talent, and Raj was one of the rare examples of a reverse process of talent moving from metropolitan India to non-metropolitan India. And then what has been discussed this whole morning, I was sitting listening, his UN study, poverty, employment, decentralization, village studies, local studies. This is late Raj. Monetary policy, planning, macro policy is early Raj. So there is a transition in the man's thinking. And I'm sure if you look at some of his notes which may not be published, I mean, since you have read everything that's been published, and I'm lobbying on your behalf with Gopal, who's sitting somewhere at the back, you get access to his personal papers. It's time the biography of K.N. Raj is written. Nobody has done it till now.
Isaac, one last. Hello.
Hello.
Whoops.
I'm
Michael, me first, then you.
okay.
I think the caste question that was just raised is absolutely fascinating. Here is someone who is sort of coming of age right at that turn after independence. Coming of age, I mean intellectual age. And is right in the center of everything. Now, that period we know was a period of huge ferment in terms of the making of the Constitution. And there is no way that caste discussions were not happening all of the time. And yet Raj goes the Nehruvian route. I'm not saying there's a discrepancy, but the work on caste, the discussions on caste, really don't enter into the structure of his writings from that period, despite the fact that given his own caste background and his knowledge of ground level, he was very aware, as people have said, about the importance of caste. And I just wonder whether the reason for this tension, dichotomy, whatever you want to call it, in his approach to caste came from the fact that that period of post-colonial was the period of the developmental state. And there was nothing in the discussions of the developmental state that anywhere that really seriously addressed social inequalities of different kinds, whether gender or caste or any of it. It's not there. And it's exciting. It's the reins of power. It's the heart of the debate. And so, but in India, it's fascinating because there's another debate going on at the same time, which is the constitution-related debate. So I think wherever this gets pursued, I think just asking the question about Ken Raj and caste would be fascinating. It's a great, great dissertation for someone to work on. I won't say much about gender, which perhaps at another time, but it certainly did not enter into his thinking, particularly as far as I knew him.
Michael, absolutely the last bit.
I just want to bring something to the attention of everybody. Long back, there was a request from the director, All India Radio Trivandrum, to Raj, that they would like to have a freewheeling interview of him for a long period. He can choose the interviewer, and Raj asked me whether to be the interviewer, and I was allowed to interview him for 3.5 hours. Half hour in Malayalam for the local station, 3 hours for the archives of the All India Radio in Delhi. And I still remember Raj's humor when the director said that I asked the director whether it would be broadcast soon. He said, no, this is for the archives. So Raj said it is for the obituary that when I pass away, they will be broadcasting it. And this is there. Much later, Bipin Chandra, when he became the chairman of the National Book Trust, I told Bipin about this, and Bipin was highly excited, and I asked him whether he can use his influence to get this published. And so he was highly excited, and in fact he suggested, verbally, I have no record of that, a title for that. Can Raj on Raj, as told to P.K. Michael Tharagan. This is the title that he suggested. And then he said, pardon? Pardon? Can Raj on Raj, or Raj on Can Raj. I don't know how it is. As told to P.K. Michael Tharagan. And, but obviously soon after Bipin shifted from that position and all that. There is another interesting story about Bipin and Raj. They talked about death, which also has been recorded, and that is in a different context. But I'm saying that that's also fascinating, how he was preoccupied with matters like that. I'm only bringing this to the attention of this group, either the Alumni Association or CDS or somebody who has got influence in Delhi can get this material out of the archives and get it published. It may be good.
I hope this will be a last question for the session.
No, I'm just flagging it for tomorrow. I mean, the question about caste and the Kendraj's vision is very, very interesting. The paper that Suraj mentioned, that paper on village India and its political economy, it's also the subject that of the paper that Ram and I have written, which we'll be presenting tomorrow. So the question there is whether Raj is aware of caste or no. That is not the question. The question is that what was he aware of in terms of caste and village. I think his understanding of caste and village was largely related to land. Now, over time, the importance of land has gone down, and many other forms of caste level interventions have come in. So maybe that approach that he followed at that time was more focused on land, therefore it did not cover many other aspects of caste. Not only Raj, I'm talking about the entire generation of economists of that generation, did not look at caste in very multifaceted kind of way, the way we are looking at it now. I think the question is not about whether Raj knew about caste or no, but in what way did he understand? And is that adequate to understand caste in society today? I'm just plugging it because the paper is tomorrow. We can discuss it further. Thank you.
Yes. I have nothing much to add. It has been a very interesting discussion. In fact, Raj's the institutional context. Caste is an important institution that is explicitly considered. That is one of the institutions specific of Indian agrarian economy as discussed by him. So it has been very informative, interesting, and certain fundamental questions raised. Thank you very much.
Now we have a 10-minute tea break. Conference stays ready at Shamiana. Yeah. Please have your tea and come back at 4 p.m. The next session of the series will start at 4 p.m. Thank you.
Check. Check.
Hello. Hello. We are about to start the next session of the series. So good afternoon all. We now commence the second session of the series titled Professor K.N. Raj, Scholar and Institution Builder. The second session will be chaired by Professor K.L. Krishna, one of the India's most distinguished economists and former professor and head of the department at Delhi School of Economics. The presentation will begin with Professor K.P. Kannan, Honorary Fellow at CDS and Chairman of Laurie Baker Center and Cosford. He speaks on K.N. Raj, his life and his time. This will be followed by Reminiscences from Professor M.A. Umen, Honorary Fellow at CDS and a distinguished economist, and Dr. A.V. Joss, visiting faculty at CDS and an economist at International Labour Organization. The session will end at 5:55 p.m. with a 10-minute question-answer period. We extend warm welcome to all our esteemed speakers. This stage is now yours. Thank you.
So you have any?
Dear friends, before I begin, I would like to thank Dr. Veeramani and Professor Mandal, Sudipta Mandal, of course also by another friend, Bina, so for inviting me to present this, to be present at this meeting. I think the subtopic for this session is the life and time of Professor K.N. Raj. I think this is a very important theme. Probably one and full day should have been allotted to this. But now I don't want to question this. We will proceed on the basis of this. We have 70 minutes for this session. I think 30 minutes, and you will get, you of course will get the major share of the time. I would like to make some introductory remarks on this topic of life and time of Professor K.N. Raj, because he was a central figure in Delhi School of Economics for 1953 to 1970. 17 years. That was the most important period in Delhi School of Economics in terms of its building up, strengthening and so on. He was instrumental in, I think, bringing in stalwarts like Amartya Sen, Sukhma Chakravarti, A.L. Nagar, Tapan Rai Chaudhary, also Jagadish Bhagwati, because he did not stay very long, Jagadish Bhagwati, and Manmohan Singh. Toward the end of 1960s, Manmohan Singh also was inducted to Delhi School of Economics. Their presence there for in that decade made a big difference to the standing of the Delhi School of Economics. I can go on talking for a long time on this topic, but some of my comments are recorded in a paper which I am not giving it here, the saga of the Delhi School of Economics. It covers a long period, entire period, beginning from 1949 till 2010. I think it appeared in a volume which is, of course, brought out by Uma Kapila. Uma Kapila in honor of her husband, who was a student of Delhi School of Economics in 1953-55 at that time. And of course, I did not exceed the time limit, the page limit they given to me within that period. I covered what happened in Delhi School or really 1949 to 2010. So that book came out in 2010. So many changes have occurred, I think, but now I am confining myself to what Professor K.N. Raj contributed to the strengthening of the Delhi School of Economics. I think, as I mentioned, he was there for 17 years, and the most momentous period for Delhi School of Economics is 1960s. So he became chairman, he became director in 1962 after Professor B.N. Ganguly went as Vice Chancellor of Delhi University. Several times I have mentioned that Professor V.K. Rao gave the building in terms of physical infrastructure, Ratan Tata Library, it was V.K. Rao who contributed most. In terms of intellectual, academic aspects, it was K.N. Raj who made the most difference. As I mentioned, because of his initiative and his efficiency, he could bring in all the stalwarts, and of course, unfortunately, they left at the end of 1960s. In 1970, 71, there was an exodus. Therefore, but I think the strength of Delhi School of Economics was so good that we could withstand that exodus. I think, and much later, in early 90s, the Center for Development Economics was created, but thanks to the initiative of Kaushik Basu and all of us, I think the presence of Delhi School of Economics made a big difference. Made a big difference. I think we did not suffer in terms of standards. The major contribution of K.N. Raj is strengthening the curriculum, PhD program, and general discipline, because he has set up good traditions of decentralizing the administration, but he tried to do this at the Delhi University level. There he faced opposition, and he in disgust he resigned and said I would go to Trivandrum and set up a CDE. That's how I think his coming here was in some terms sudden and precipitated, because the vested interest in Delhi University did not allow him enough freedom as Vice Chancellor. But his contribution is monumental to Delhi School of Economics. I think, as I mentioned, both teaching standards and the PhD program have been strengthened in mid-1960s, thanks to the support of Amartya Sen, Sukba Chakravarti, Tapan Rai Chaudhary, and A.L. Nagar and others. I think everybody supported, and that kind of a strength persisted, available for a long time. I will not take more time. Now I will request our main speaker, Dr. Kannan, who has been my old friend, and I request him to speak on the life and time of K.N. Raj. Yeah. Thank you.
ഓൺ ചെയ്യാമോ? നേരത്തെ എടുത്തത്. തുറന്നു വെച്ചിട്ടുണ്ടായിരുന്നു. ഉണ്ടല്ലേ? Thank you. Yeah. Professor K.L. Krishna and esteemed friends, I would also like to thank Professor Birmani and his fantastic team for organizing this event to remember the life and times of Professor K. N. Raj. I know there are veterans sitting here who are much more authentic and competent, and Chiranjeev is smiling, to talk about Raj, and I am sure they will do so. But I told Veermani that I am not going to talk about Professor Raj's intellectual contributions, which is the subject of so many sessions. So I would rather focus on his life and times. The first thing that comes to my mind is this quotation, believed to be from Buddha. In 2001 or so, maybe 2002, I'm not sure about it, when I visited Professor Raj in his house, I saw a small statue of Buddha there. And I knew Professor Raj was not very religious, no rituals, he didn't follow any ritual. So out of curiosity, I asked him, how come there is a statue of Buddha? He smiled and said, this is K.R. Narayanan's gift, but I value it. Then mischievously he took his small diary from his pocket, and the first page of the diary, this is what he had written. Believe nothing, merely because thou have been told it, or because it is traditional, or because you yourself have imagined it. Do not believe what your teacher teaches you, merely out of respect for the teacher, but whatever after due examination and analysis you find conducive to the good, the benefit, the well-being of all things, that doctrine believe and cling to and take it as your guide. And he put it back in his pocket. I didn't pursue the conversation then, but I thought later, after his death, I wrote about in my own way, his intellectual contributions in the special issue of the Development and Change in 2011. So those of you youngsters who would like to read that, you can go to that journal. But I thought about it and talked to quite a few people and started doing some hobby research to find out Dr. Raj's family background and the influence that his family might have had on his makeup, and to be an agnostic, and in company with Buddha's saying, because Buddha was also an agnostic. When I did that, this is Raj when he was born, when I did that, I found, to my pleasant surprise, that he belonged to a very distinguished family in Trichur. His grandfather, mother's father, maternal grandfather, was called Ayakuti Judge. The Judge surname came to him because he was a district judge in the Cochin state then. Then some of our friends, Ram Mohan, K.T. Ram Mohan in particular, another distinguished alumni, his searched around and sent me an article about Ayakuti Judge. And I talked to Gopal, Rajasthan, also talked to Justice Sukumaran, who is still around in 94, in Ernakulam, who is Dr. Raja's brother-in-law, his cousin sister's husband. And then I realized his grandfather was born around 1866, you can imagine. And he went to Madras Presidency College in 1880s and took his degree BA and then BL. The article didn't mention, but Justice Sukumaran told me that one of his classmates was a member of the Cochin royal family. They became friends. So that gave him a connection to the royal family. He came back, applied for a job. The significance of, and he got it. The significance of that is Ayakuti Judge belonged to the Irava community. And the princely state of Travancore and Cochin, for that matter, never allowed those other than upper caste members to be recruited into the government service. So the friendship with a member of the royal family enabled him, and they recognized that he was the first matriculate and graduate from the Irava community in the state of Cochin. And he rose in the ranks and became a district judge. But that's not the reason why, as Raj later wrote in a note, which I am now privy to, that my grandfather was a venerable man, engaged in social service for the upliftment of people who were till then oppressed. Then I found out that Ayakuti Judge was indeed one of the foremost social reformers or reform leaders. He was very close to Sri Narayana Guru, who had established an ashram in Cochin, in Alua, and he used to be a frequent visitor there. He influenced a lot of young, educated members of the Irava community. Sahodaran Ayyappan was one, was a radical social reformer. When Narayana Guru said, one caste, one religion, one God, Ayyappan said later, no caste, no God, no religion. He was a rationalist at that time. And he used to consult Ayakuti Judge in various matters. And their common interest was Buddhism. So they collaborated and wrote and translated Buddha's Dhammapadam into Malayalam. And Ayakuti Judge published articles on Buddhism in the magazine that Brother Ayyappan used to publish. It was also called Brother, Sahodaran. Ayyappan's significance was that he, as a young man, he went a step further and he organized interdining by including Dalit children in Cochin. And he faced immense opposition, including from his own community, who thought they are much above the Dalit caste. But interestingly, I found in the write-up on Ayakuti Judge, Sri Narayana Guru used to have regular inter-caste dining in his ashram. But nobody dared to object to that because it was inside the ashram and by the Guru. So this collaboration also led to a personal alliance between Ayakuti Judge and Ayyappan. Ayakuti Judge's eldest daughter, he had 10 children, 6 boys, 4 girls. The eldest girl was Parvati Ayyappan, and in Kerala now her name is quite well known as also another social reformer because she took to her father's steps. Sorry. she took to her father's steps, and she was very much attracted by Ayyappan, who used to visit their house. And Ayyappan also, the attraction was mutual, and they decided to marry. Ayyappan was 13 years elder to Parvati, and Parvati waited for an appropriate time for the marriage, because Raj's mother was the second girl, and she got married in 1923, and Parvati got married in 1930. So Raj used to, I had a series of conversations with Raj in the late 90s and early 20s, because that was when he was more relaxed and he would call and sit around. I asked for formal interviews. He said no. He said, shall I record? No. We'll just talk. So he just said, my father, who is from Calicut, his name, the KN stands for Kakkad. Kakkad is a village near Calicut. Nandarath Raj. How did this Nandarath came about? So Rajas, in the note he wrote that his paternal grandfather was a very good horticulturist and florist. And they moved to Calicut town and set up a garden. So it was called Nandavanam. And you know, Nandavanam means what it is. And we got that name, the village name and this garden name. But my father was equally progressive, he said. Whenever you ask him about his family, I told him once, took some liberty, I said, I heard that you were born with a silver spoon in your mouth. He just smiled and just laughed as usual. Then he said, my mother's side was well off, but not my father. He was a self-made man. And then we'll go on about his father. He will not stop when he talks about his father. So I said, you are quite partial to your father. Yes, my father was a remarkable man. He encouraged me to read. He used to give me pocket money in the school days and ask me to buy this book, that book. He will suggest the titles, and he cultivated my reading habit. And he later, he himself thought about his higher education when he was a student in Madras Christian College. He got admission details, brochures from Cambridge, Oxford, and LSE. So I'm sure his father was also a district judge, but he was in the Madras government service, the Malabar district, from which I also belong to. So his father told him, Cambridge and Oxford are very elite institutions, I am told. I think it would be good for you to go to LSE. So there are progressive professors and students from third world. So he said, that's how I got into. But to cut the long story about Buddhism short, his father was also an agnostic. And that's why as a young man, he wanted to marry somebody who will also appreciate his thinking. So one of his friends suggested to him, go to Cochin, meet Ayakuti Judge. I think he has 3 or 4 daughters. You will definitely get one. So Dr. Raj told me, my father came to my grandfather's house and asked for the eldest daughter, Parvati. She was committed to Ayyappan, and the father knew about it. So his father told him, in a way, you know, my eldest daughter is almost married, so I'm sorry. So as he was going out, Raj was saying with a quirky smile, he called him back and said, my second daughter is now of marriageable age, 19 years. Would you like to marry her? So the young man said, I'll think about it. And then he promptly replied, yes. And that's how that marriage took place. Why I'm saying is when Dr. Raj was born in 1924, the ferment in the Cochin state about social dignity was very strong. Ayyappan was leading a lot of the, this kind of agitations, also rationalist movement. And his father was influenced by the Malabar rationalist group led by what we call one Mitavadi Krishnan, C. Krishnan. So he was also a follower. So it is my surmise that he must have been very much influenced by the family background discussions of Buddhism. In 1926, there was a conference in Cochin in which Sahodaran Ayyappan, with the blessings of Ayakuti Judge and along with C. Krishnan, declared they are converting to Buddhism. Of course, that set the community in some kind of turbulence, and the biography of Ayyappan says that he retraced it after a couple of decades when he had to contest for an election, and everybody said you can only be a candidate in this reserved Irava constituency if you declare that you are an Irava and not a Buddhist. So that's another story. So I think this kind of background must have definitely influenced Raj. Then I thought, was he aware of the caste to which he was born into? And it's very interesting in the note that he left. This is the only incident of his experience or awareness of caste, and it's very interesting what he has written. And Raj says, since we were Tiyas, the Iravas in Malabar are called Tiyas. But if you ask a Malabar Tiya, he would say they are superior to Iravas. So that's another sub-story within our caste system. Since we were Tiyas who had fought their way up the Hindu caste ladder through Sri Narayana Guru's social movements under the banner, one God, one man, one caste, we were by this time just within the acknowledged touchable communities, those still regarded by many of the Orthodox Hindus as really polluting and therefore untouchable. When my father was transferred from Palghat to a Tamil district in the province of Madras, the lawyers practicing in his court invited him to a farewell dinner party. But when my father learned that most of the Brahmin lawyers would sit in another room for the dinner to avoid pollution, he withdrew from the party as a gesture of courtesy and mild protest. A significant point I should not fail to mention is that while these little events were symbolic of the grip that caste still had on a large number of persons belonging to the middle class, there was a total transformation of the scene when my father, after being transferred from Palghat to an obscure town in Chettinad, some 350 miles south of Madras city, was retransferred back to Palghat as a subordinate judge around 1939 or 40. The social responses in the town from persons we knew just a few years earlier were much more positive and clear. It was perhaps a measure of the impact Mahatma Gandhi had, meanwhile, on even the most orthodox of India. For Palghat and Kalpati were no ordinary towns, but citadels of the more orthodox in the country. They were transformed very slowly, perhaps, but transformed nevertheless, of which T.N. Sheshan is a good example. Then he says that after 1941, I had no occasion to come to Malabar or Cochin, till nearly 3 decades later. At Madras, I was not clearly identified with any particular caste, but recognized broadly as a non-Brahmin. Later, when I left for London in July 1944, I went out altogether from the grasp of caste. And after I returned to Bombay and Delhi from 1948 onward, I was in so different a society that I had no occasion to taste in any way the tyranny or the subtleties of caste, though I knew they existed all around me in no less unpleasant a form than in Madras. By the time I returned to Kerala in 1971, the social situation had changed so radically that caste had almost ceased to be the heavy stone around one's neck, that it was even 2 decades earlier. If this happens also in equal measure in other parts of India, particularly in the north, middle and southeast of the country, we shall have truly won our freedom. I am not sure the high marks he gave to Kerala that we are able to sustain it, but that's another story altogether. What I wanted to bring to your attention is that these facts were very real and affected, although in a very small measure. He also told me that his father, when he was around 7 or so, when his father got transferred to Kannur or Tellicherry. Oh, sorry, we didn't. Oh, this photo has not come. He was just 7 years old, and he was put in a school called St. Joseph's Elementary School. He was admitted to the 4th standard at the age of 7. So he says he skipped 1, 2, 3 because his mother and father had taught him sufficiently in English, Malayalam, and arithmetics. So I was able to get admission to the 4th standard. So one can imagine that he proved his brilliance at the age of 7. Then his father was transferred very frequently to other parts of Tamil Nadu. He and his mother decided to put him in charge, under the charge of his uncle, his father's younger brother, who was a medical doctor in Madras Medical College. And he stayed with them and went to the Madras Christian College, which was located in Georgetown. Then the college later, or the high school, but the college was separated later and located in Tambaram. What I want to also say is that he was born into a very elite, prosperous family. And how it happened, how the initial conditions became so favorable for his grandfather to go to college in the 19th century is something I think one needs to probe much further. I have some clues, but I'm not sharing it because it's not definitive, how the family initial conditions were so good. They were landed gentry at that time. And every community except the Dalits and Adivasis, highly differentiated, including Brahmins. You had very rich people, also very poor people. So in a way it reflected that. At the age of 16, he completed his matriculation at the age of 15. 2 years in the elementary school, then 6 years for high school. And he completed his graduation when he was 20 in Madras Christian College, of which he has also written a few lines in that. But that's not very relevant now. Then he went to England in 1944 for MSc. So when his supervisor read the thesis, I don't remember his name, he suggested that if you stay on for another few months, extend this essay, I will recommend you for a PhD. So that's how from BA honors to PhD, and he came and he took 34 months to complete his PhD. At the age of 23, he came back to India with a PhD. And he told me a couple of incidents while in London. One was, so the silver spoon that I asked him, it didn't follow him, but he earned certain silver spoons. And the first one was his meeting Krishna Menon, V.K. Krishna Menon. And he was engaged in organizing all young Indian students, India League march to the House of Commons, sending them to counties to speak about. In one such incident, Raj was sent to a county interior, and Labour Party workers will take care of their boarding and lodging for a day or two. So Raj said I went and spoke in one weekend about India's independence. This was in 1945 or 46. After he spoke, a grandmother rose from the, and she came to the stage and hugged him and said, "You speak such good English. How come you tolerate the British there? Why are you not independent?" That was one such incident. He said, "I enjoyed their hospitality. Common people everywhere are the same." The second one was Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru visited London frequently, and Krishna Menon used to persuade him to come and meet these students. And he introduced, while introducing other students, he introduced Raj to him. He gave a shake hand, and he said, "What are you studying for?" Raj said, "I am writing a thesis on the monetary policy of the Reserve Bank of India." "Oh, do they have one?" That was the first meeting, he said. And the second incident, V.K.R.V. Rao comes, and he was in a hurry to set up something like a London School of Economics in Delhi, and wanted to recruit people, bright Indian students. And in Cambridge, they were because of wartime, and Raj was sitting and talking to I.G. Patel, who was already a lecturer there, and V.K.R.V. Rao was persuading I.G. Patel to return. So Raj said, he told me that I.G. didn't want to go back because he had already negotiated a lectureship in Harvard, but he didn't have the guts to tell Rao about it. So he said, "I have some difficulty, this, that. But Dr. Rao, there are other bright students here." He said, "Who? Who are there?" Then he said, "Here is one, Ken Raj." So Rao had a talk with him, and Raj told me that when you complete and come back to India, that would be next year, you meet me. So he came back in 1947, landed in Bombay. Instead of going back to Thrissur where his parents were, he straight went to Delhi and met Rao. Rao was in a very pensive mood. He said, "I'm so sorry, I can't offer you anything. I wanted to offer you a readership in the Delhi school, but Panditji told me that we have no money because of partition, settlements and all that. We have to wait. So I'll give you a recommendation letter." And he wrote a recommendation letter to C.G. Deshmukh, who was governor of the Reserve Bank. So all this, one silver spoon goes to another silver spoon, and then he comes back to Bombay, takes the letter, goes to the Reserve Bank of India and meets the personal staff. The governor is not there, and they read his, and he said, "I detected there were a lot of Tamil Brahmins in the staff, and one of them asked me, 'Where are you from?' And he wanted to find out what caste he was. He didn't say anything, so they kept. He said, "I came back to Thrissur and waited for a couple of months, no reply. Later, when he joined the Reserve Bank, 5 minutes. Then joined the Reserve Bank, he realized that the letter went to the table of the governor 8 months after. So Raj, by the time he was in Thrissur without a job, PhD, no employment, he saw an advertisement in the Times of India for a position as assistant editor in Ceylon Daily Times. And it struck a chord with his family because his grandfather had visited Ceylon. His mother's sister, Parvati Ayyappan, she worked in Ceylon as a teacher for 2 years. So she said, "Go, it's a nice place." And he went to Ceylon. He was assistant editor of the Ceylon Times for about 8 months. Then the family gets a letter from the Reserve Bank and saying that, "Please report to the governor as soon as possible." Then they invite him, then he goes to the Reserve Bank of India. I'm sure many of you know the rest of the thing. He was very impressed by this young man, and as somebody said in the earlier sessions, that he prepared the first balance of payments and fixed the exchange rate between Pakistan and India, because there were a lot of disputes. And Sridhi Deshmukh made him his secretary in his capacity as financial representative of the government of India to US and UK. And in that capacity, he accompanied him also to the IMF. So obviously, Deshmukh was very impressed. And when Deshmukh was invited to Delhi as Minister for Finance, Deshmukh suggested Raj also shift to Delhi. So that's how I think he ended up in the Planning Commission. That's well known. There are several stories of that. There were only two young economists. Raj was one, and J.J. Anjaria from the Bombay School of Economics, to which I belong. And Raj wrote this chapter, Perspective Planning, as well as the introduction. And I wanted to test with him the story with Nehru's conversation. So Panditji was greatly upset after reading. And in between, Raj said, you know, Panditji used to read the chapters, chapter by chapter, to the cabinet. So Tarlok Singh, who was the secretary, ICS, and he was the handyman of the Prime Minister, asked him, Panditji, why do you read the chapters to the cabinet? He said, do you think they will read otherwise? So that was also an indication of the importance that he attached to the planning process. And when Panditji saw that it will take 27 years to double the per capita income in the Raj's Perspective Planning paper, raising the rate of saving from 5% to 20%, isn't it? Yeah, okay. And the rate of growth, aggregate rate of growth worked out was 4.25, but they assumed a population rate of growth of 1.25 only. Of course, it went more beyond that, 2%, so it went awry. So Gandhiji was upset, my God, such a slow process of transformation. Who wrote this chapter? So Tarlok Singh said that we have an expert who is a returned from LSE, Dr. K.N. Raj. Call him in. So then there was an appointment. Raj told me that, yes, he went to meet the Prime Minister. As Prime Minister, he was seeing for the first time. He was really trembling. And Panditji was all in red and very upset. Where did you learn your economics from? So he said, London School of Economics. But we were located in Cambridge. So we also had the advantage of talking to famous economists, John Robinson, Maurice Dobb, and other kinds of people. So he said, can we afford to wait so long? So the legend is that Raj asked his permission to ask a question. So Panditji said, go ahead. He said, would you like to be a Stalin? So it seems, so I asked him, did you really ask this question? This is the story that I have heard. He just smiled. He didn't say yes, he didn't say no. So I think he didn't want to give too much importance to his bravery or something. But he told me something else. He said, after our conversation, Panditji got pacified. He got up, he came to the other end of the table, hugged him and said, we should meet more often. And that happened. And in the D School book he writes, when he became director, Panditji called him in 1961 and had a discussion with him on the need to attract talent in the Delhi school. He said, you meet me once a year. So he has written in that book, Raj's chapter, 61 I met, 62 I met, 63 when I met, Panditji was a very different person after the Chinese, the conflict with the Chinese. His interest had waned. He just murmured something to me and I returned. There are many other kinds of stories, but what I feel is that although he was born with a silver spoon, he didn't rest on the laurels of that spoon. Every step he took, he got new silver spoons, I think. But he kept his characters, though intact, no religious, caste or social discrimination feelings, and very true to the Buddha's tests of experiencing, knowing, empirical.
Please conclude.
Yeah. Was very much there. And I think that personality stayed with him for long. And I will just run through this three-piece suited Raj in London, and you can see the transformation. Then with C.D. Deshmukh, the team that went to IMF meetings in Washington, Raj had no tie, only the coat is there. Then the Panditji signing the first plan document, Raj is there at the last. The Sardarji is the Tarlok Singh. Gulsarlal Nanda is the deputy chairman. Raj's marriage photo with Sarasama. Raj as vice chancellor, receiving Padma Vibhushan. And 2004 we had a celebration here when he attained 80 years. Thank you so much, and I'm sure we will have another occasion to discuss the remaining part of his life. Thank you.
Thank you for cooperating. I request Dr. Roman to reminisce for the 10 minutes.
Esteemed Professor K.L. Krishna, friends, I thank the director for inviting me, although I don't think I am eminently qualified. My topic is K.N. Raj of the 1960s, Reminiscences of a non-Nigerian teacher of economics. From the early 1950s, as a student of MA Economics at the Travancore University, later rechristened as Kerala University, and in my career as a university teacher of economics at the Kerala University. Three Malayali names attracted my imagination, and indeed of every Indian who are professionals and economists. They are in age sequence. One, Dr. John Mathai, 1886 to 1959, finance member of Lord Wavell's Viceroy's Council, whom the Viceroy identified as the most brilliant of his team, the first railway minister and a finance minister in 1948, who could deliver the budget speech without a script. Two, Dr. P.J. Thomas, economic advisor from 1942 to 47 of the British Raj, Indian delegate to the Bretton Woods Conference 1944, and continued as Nehru's economic advisor. As I was listening to the talk before I came there, he resurveyed Slater's villages. And see Professor K.N. Raj, 1924 to 2010, teacher, scholar, and policy maker, all rolled into one. I am uniquely placed in that I have met all of them, listened to them, and have studied a lot about them. If I were to start with the senior most, Dr. John Mathai, I was the first to be appointed to the Dr. John Mathai Center at Trichu, and privileged to know many of the family members. All these economists, scrupulously honest, were known for their courage of conviction. Each one of them excelled in his own way and by his originality and analytical acumen. Although Mathai was not an academic per se, the first Taxation Inquiry Commission 53-54, headed by him, and the report is good enough proof of his academic capability and perspective. Dr. P.J. Thomas, whose sweep ranges from the theories of international trade and fiscal federalism to the ground realities of banking system of Natukota Chettiars of Tamil Nadu and Chittis and Kuris of Kerala, from whose womb the unique banking system of Kerala was born, as Thomas famously said. K. N. Raj belongs to this illustrious company. The task I have chosen this evening is to walk back to the 1950s and 1960s with Professor Raj, with memory as the major support stick. It was the Nehruvian times. It was the planning era at its experimental best, endeavoring to develop an annual, medium, and a long-term perspective, and a comprehensive but a progressive taxation effort covering income, expenditure, gift, and wealth, evidently to institutionalize an egalitarian society. It was a time when economists were not careerists, with many like K. N. Raj committed to their ontological vocation of transforming their society, and in caste society mired in caste class iniquities, besides being in the best tradition of gurus. The names of D.R. Gadgil, V.K.R.V. Rao, Babatosh Datta of an earlier vintage, Sukhamoy Chakravarti, Amartya Sen, C.T. Kurian, and several others forming a formidable tradition of social thinkers rather than economists qua economists. The topics like Keynesian economics in underdeveloped countries, deficit financing, Mahalanobis model, investment criteria, the concept of involuntary unemployment, disguised unemployment, and the like were the topics enthusiastically discussed at that time. I think I may not be wide of the mark if I say that Raj's emphasis on a high marginal rate of savings through a viable agrarian sector, which contributed to over 70% of commodity production, was in critical tune with the economy aiming at self-reliance. Although he was skeptical about measuring the savings of the household sector in 1962, writing in the Oxford economic papers, but later on in 1967, I think he was pressing for a higher than 25% marginal rate of savings in his paper in the Economic and Political Weekly in the context of the fourth five-year plan, which through a 5% rate of growth, projecting and planning to double per capita income in a reasonable period of time. Raj surely wanted, I'm going to quickly read and finish off. This was a natural response to an angry Raj who was opposed to PL 480 food aid and all aid with the strings attached. Whenever Professor Raj visited Trivandrum, invariably public lectures were held at Student Center, YWCA, which I seldom missed. To be sure, this was because Raj had reasoning different from the fellow economists of the time. For example, the Indian Economic Association Conference 1953 held at Trivandrum, where I was a volunteer in charge of V.K.R.V. Rao, and where his paper on the investment multiplier in an underdeveloped economy was a theme of lively discussion. Encomiums galore, and that many Keynesian concepts were said to be inapplicable to underdeveloped countries. Raj was conspicuously absent at the conference. He published in Indian Economic Review an interesting note which I read with avidity. That note demonstrated his profound understanding of Keynes and his conclusion that Keynes has a relevance, and discarding Keynes and his economics is like throwing the baby away with the bathwater. These are memories still fresh in my mind. I can recall again that it was early 61 that Ken Raj, as a one-man commission, visited the Department of Economics at the Senate Hall campus where I was the lone faculty member. Realizing my apparent disquiet in confronting the commission, he talked to me for nearly half an hour like a long-standing friend and asked me to read his paper with Amartya Sen titled Alternative Patterns of Growth Under Conditions of Stagnant Export Earnings, published in the Oxford Economic Papers. With some difficulty, I found the journal and copied it and read it carefully. The somewhat extreme assumption of no export earnings with which they built their model was not surprising. That paper was probably a complement to the Mahalanobis model, which argued for the commanding heights by capital goods industry and import substitution. I would like to say here that economists like Professor Raj were not interested in models and theories that were not relevant to the needs of the aspirations of the people. They never wanted to dwell in the abstract realm of mathematical formalism. Turning to the institution building aspect, I would say that it was Professor Raj of the 60s who made the Center for Development Studies an operational reality later. It was presumably a consummation of the academic aspirations of this man. Looking back after nearly half a century of this publication, in the work, Poverty, Unemployment and Development Policy was undoubtedly a fascinating contribution and certainly a watershed. The volume meaningfully mixed development theory and development practice of a region, sui generis, in shaping its developmental path. Although I was an alien to the project, I know it virtually succeeded in exposing the continuing overemphasis on economic growth and the widespread confusion of ends and means. Yes, I will conclude in 2 minutes. The contribution of the work was easily transcending the traditional disciplinary boundaries. The project of Professor Ken Raj at his eminent blossom, teamwork at its best, and the exquisite meshing of young scholars with seasoned researchers like N. Krishnaji, I. S. Gulati, and many others under the benign leadership of K.N. Raj. I wish to end this impressionistic narrative with an anecdote which I am sure no one in the audience would have possibly known. Professor Raj had an uncanny capability to make difficult choices, as when he went ahead with the low-cost housing scheme known in the name of Laurie Baker. It was at that time a fight against the entrance to PWD engineering lobby, with their rule book held out as a Bible of prudence. It was sometime in the early 1970s. Some Sarvodaya people, with the support of some bishops, that time the density of bishops in Kerala was conspicuously low compared to now, and probably more focused on their social vision, convened a 2-day conference at Manganam, Kottayam. The theme was Land and Housing Problem of Kerala. I talked on land reform, and Baker, working in Assam at that time, on low-cost housing for Kerala. He demonstrated with several reels of pictures the need for construction revolution. As soon as he finished, late Archbishop, I am through, Benedict, an economist Economics MA first ranker from Madras University, friend of mine, sitting close to me, wanted me to take him to Baker after he finished. Almost instinctively, the bishop invited him to Thiruvananthapuram and wanted him to construct a demonstration building in front of the bishop's house. In no time, the building was built. K.N. Raj was invited to inaugurate, and it probably was the beginning of a meaningful choice or technique in India. To conclude, I am glad to have met K.N. Raj in this life's journey. I felt one with him when I saw tears rolling down when his father's body was taken out for funeral along with Dr. P.K. Gopalakrishnan. I also remember the few occasions he called me for some comments at the odd hours of the night. I recall them proudly. I remember Raj as a great institution himself, but to me he was a delightful individual, simple, sagacious, and scholarly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your contribution. Dr. Jose, please take 10 minutes. I'll do that.
Professor K.L. Krishna, Professor Ummen, Professor Kannan, and my friends and colleagues in the audience. We are here to celebrate the life and works of a great teacher. It's a memorable day for me because I'm invited to share these memories in a meeting presided over by another great teacher of mine, Professor K.L. Krishna. From the 1970s, from the 1960s, I got to know about the Delhi School of Economics. He pervaded the intellectual horizons of the social science community together with the distinguished colleagues whose names were repeatedly mentioned here. In 1971, fate conferred on me a rare privilege. I became a research assistant to Professor K.N. Raj. And that way, I got a ringside view of the shaping of one of the finest institutions in social sciences. All those years of experience, what do we learn from the work of K.N. Raj? I will flag 4 main issues without taking much time. First was his prodigious capacity to attract distinguished scholars from all over the world, befriend them, bring them over to Delhi School, make those centers of learning a magnet for scholars to come from all over the world. He repeated the same experiment in Trivandrum. It became over the years a center for pilgrimage for many people in the social sciences domain. All of us were the beneficiaries. They shared their perceptions, experiences, insights with us, and in the process enriched our intellectual horizons. Second was Professor Raj's capacity to innovate and experiment. Scholars from multidisciplinary backgrounds were invited and drilled to become top-notch social scientists, and in turn equip them to don the professional community, media, academia, administration all over India was a rare accomplishment which only Raj could have initiated. And for that, he invited some of the finest minds who were accessible to him. And let me remember them with gratitude. Professor Panikar, Vaidyanathan, Krishnan, Krishnaji, they all came dropping whatever they were doing to help him shape up this institution. It has a kind of biblical resonance about the way they came and worked for him. A third trait was his scrupulous regard for austerity and public accountability with the money he spent. Erecting this beautiful monument of artistry with apart from that, with the support of a creative genius like Laurie Baker, he was extremely concerned about spending money on the right things. There's an aside story I won't take long to describe. The eminent American policy economist who was advisor to several US administrations, John Lewis, known to Raj because of his earlier work on India, came to visit him at the time of the commencement of the Center for Development Studies. He came with the intention of offering financial support. Professor Raj took him, walked with him down that road to the medical college. Those days it was a much more rickety road, less crowded of course. Raj took him to one of those vegetarian restaurants of that time called Anand Bhavan, bought him a masala dosha, and then very gently told John Lewis, "Thank you, my dear friend, we can do without your help." And indeed, he built up this institution with maximum insistence on frugality. The fourth trait, which I consider was his most important trait, was his passionate concern for hard work. He was the very epitome of tireless striving, stretching its arms towards perfection. There was no compromise from K.N. Raj with regard to the quality and content of the work by students. He would spend any amount of time trying to make a better scholar out of you, but then he spent a lot of time cutting the rough edges in you and making you drive up the wall. I have seen a number of my colleagues going through that experience. But then to my friends here in the morning who are sharing their anguish about the time they were preparing a research thesis, let me say a word of advice. It's eminently worth doing. All that agony, all that anguish will equip you to become better human beings in a far more demanding world of work. And then let me also recall those wonderful seminars he compared. There were places he displayed erudition, articulation, and amazing self-discipline, which everyone was bound to learn. There was no way anyone could shoot his mouth off or make a flippant remark. Fear of God was indeed fear of K.N. Raj that pervaded all the seminar halls of this place. And then the net result was those of us who got trained under him became glued to this place. We developed a kind of tremendous loyalty to this place, which kept us rooted in India, enabled us to come back after our working life, but then coming back towards the time when Raj's health was fading was quite a very painful experience. Arguably, the most eminent mind one has seen was falling into the deep recess of amnesia, and it was very painful to many of us. But then he was kept cheerful thanks to the kind of benign care, love, and affection conferred on him by Gopal and Deena with the support of Hari and Vasanta. And when Raj faded out, it was again a privilege that I could be around as his ashes were consigned to the Indian Ocean. That ocean he had a deep bond with, and the Indian Ocean always reminds you of Raj's calm, his depth, his bounty, and his amazing occasional bouts of fury we were all subjected to. Before I conclude, let me take a minute more, not even a minute, to bring to your attention. It's also a time beyond hagiography. We tried to build a proper memorial on the occasion of this centenary, and I would argue for a state-of-the-art Center for Development Studies with a huge financial investment which can thereby keep on attracting talents from all over the world. One more thing, it's time we also thought of writing an intellectual biography of the Center for Development Studies, because the early years of the center, as was mentioned, Raj put his foot down but took important decisions concerning the autonomy of the institution, the kind of a history which remains to be written. And I hope all of us will take these projects seriously. Thank you very much.
Now we will take up the question on the answers. Please raise your hands to those who have questions and to whom it is directed. No questions? I think I have enjoyed the presentations by Professor Kannan, Professor Woman, and Dr. Jose. In fact, they're apart from the main presentation by Professor Kannan, both of your interventions are very good, very knowledgeable. Thank you. Thank you very much. And if there are no questions, therefore we will conclude the session because we are running behind schedule. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, everybody. Yeah.
Hi all.
Hello everyone.
The next session will start soon. I would like to request. One minute. Now, I would like to request Professor Chiranjeev Sen, Dr. Sanjay Baru, Dr. Ram Manohar Reddy, Professor J. Devika, please come on the dais. Good afternoon. Hello. Good afternoon all. We now commence the third session on Professor K. N. Raj, Scholar and Institution Builder. This session will be chaired by Professor Chiranjeev Sen. He is a distinguished professor at the School of Liberal Study, BML, Manjula University, and a former professor at IIM Bangalore. We have with us Dr. Sanjay Baru, who is a political commentator and policy analyst, and a former Secretary General of the Federation of Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. He will speak on K. N. Raj and the political economy of intermediate regime. This will be followed by reminiscence from Dr. Ram Manohar Reddy, who is the editor of the Indian Forum and a former editor of Economic and Political Weekly. Professor J. Devika is a professor at Center for Development Study, will discuss about the souvenir. We warmly welcome you all to the dais. Now floor is yours. Thank you, sir.
Am I audible? Am I audible? Yeah. Thank you very much. Without much ado, let's get started with the last session of the day. We've been treated to a series of very, very wonderful, very moving and exciting discussion. I'm really feeling very charged after what I've heard, and I'm sure that what comes right now will keep up the great momentum that we have built up during the day. I won't make much time just to say what's this topic about. Essentially, as I understand it, it is Raj's foray into political economy. We've talked about his contributions to economics. We've talked about the fact that he was very aware of the relationship between economics and other fields. But in the work on intermediate regimes, he actually integrated in a much more direct way his concept of the political economy of what I might call the capitalist state. And he, of course, built his work on India. And the essential theme of his two famous essays on intermediate regimes is about the class dynamics that sustains the capitalist state. What kind of alignments, what kind of class alignments are there to enable the kind of development policies that Nehru and subsequent planners have pursued? You can dream about the economics, but unless it is in tune with the political realities, it won't happen. And Raj was trying to draw upon and draw attention to of the policymakers and everybody as to what kind of challenges are required, what kind of class balances are required to make it sustainable. That's my understanding of this whole work that is on intermediate regimes. Why do you call it intermediate regimes? Essentially, it is a regime, the term is due to Kaleski, but it is basically the idea about how whether the lower middle class or the middle class can sustain political leadership. That's the essence of it. And while they did it, the vehicle through which the middle class did it was state capitalism. And so how it would work, how it would sustain, what would it need, what are the challenges, that is what he wanted to highlight. Even though Raj's work was done in the 60s and 70s, the issues that he's raised have become extremely relevant today. Because, of course, the middle class is no longer in power. And of course, Raj's ideas were taken forward by Pranab Bardhan. It's very, almost a continuation, which he called dominant classes. But in today's world, when state capitalism is totally almost gone, and the struggle of the middle class to survive and be politically relevant, the middle classes, the professional classes, whatever you want to call them, that is a very real issue facing us today. And so I hope that Dr. Baru, when he speaks about the subject, will not only talk about Professor Raj, but talk about the relevance of this whole theme in today's context. So with this, let me invite Dr. Baru to speak.
Mr. Chairperson, Dr. K.L. Krishna, Dr. Viramani, ladies and gentlemen. I was saying a little while back that the evening or the day should have ended with Joseph's poetic tributes. It's been a long day, a rather intense day, and I feel particularly handicapped coming at the end of a long day when I'm sure most of us are ready for a drink, to impose on you a lecture which I've actually written down. But I don't think I'll do that because we are all a bit too tired. Let me first begin by thanking the director of CDS, Dr. Viramani, for doing me this honor. I come back to CDS after 39 years. The last time I was invited to speak here was at the Industrialization Conference in 1985 when Professor Raj was still around. And after that, this is my second appearance at CDS. It's been a long gap. So I'm grateful to you for doing this honor. I assumed when I was invited to speak that this would be some kind of an academic seminar, so I wrote a paper, but I realized that this afternoon was devoted to paying tribute to Professor Raj. And so therefore what I'm going to do is really to speak within the kind of sentiments of the afternoon, rather than bore you with quotations and from Kaletsky and Charles Bettelheim and K.N. Raj and E.M.S. Namboodiripad, etc. I was also inspired by the talk that Dr. Jacob gave earlier today, and having read some things that he has written, to make the suggestion earlier this afternoon that there is a early Raj and a late Raj. And I think when I think about his paper on intermediate regimes, which, as Dr. Jacob reminded us, evolved out of an earlier paper which he had written in 1964, exploring the idea, but without using the term intermediate regime, that this was something he was thinking about in that period. Clearly 64, it was after Nehru's death. The context was slightly different from 73. And so the question I ask in this paper is not to explain his argument of intermediate regime, or not to pick bones with his analysis, but to ask the question, why 1973? Why did Professor Raj devote the Kale Memorial Lecture to this subject? And I think the answer to that has to be in the transition that he was going through, in the period which KP Kannan described very well, his early years as a member of the Reserve Bank of India, a member of, an important functionary of the Planning Commission, an advisor to Jawaharlal Nehru, an advisor to Indira Gandhi, till they parted company. And here was an economist who was thinking of a new India, the real new India, after independence. An India that was constituted by a constitution that was written by an elected constituent assembly that comprised of a wide range of individuals who belonged to the middle class. H.V. Kamath, Durgabai Deshmukh, B.R. Ambedkar. This was not a constituent assembly written by Tata Birla. It was a constituent assembly, it was a constitution written by the leadership of the Indian national movement that was essentially middle class, and created a framework for development of a post-independence India. And it was that India that inspired Professor Raj and his generation to immerse themselves in nation building. And that is what they were doing through the 50s and through most of the 60s. And yet by the time we come to the end of the 60s, there is already Guru Dutt singing Kahan Hai, the famous song in Pyasa, the promise of New India was already up in flames. There were 3 wars: a war with China, a war with Pakistan, a second war with Pakistan, a major balance of payments crisis where he parted company with many of his colleagues at the Delhi School of Economics, Bhagwati, Srinivasan, Padma Desai. He had already begun to part company in many ways with Amartya Sen, with a lot of people, even with someone like Sukhmoy, because he was beginning to see India very differently. And as I said earlier today, his transition to Kerala and his becoming immersed in local development, district planning, decentralization, empowerment of the rural economy was a different Raj. And what connects the early Raj to the late Raj is really this change in his understanding of the political economy of India. His disappointment with the post-Nehruvian years. He was still an admirer of Nehru, even if you read his 64 essay, which I thank Dr. Jacob for drawing my attention to. He was still an admirer of Nehru. But by the time we come to 73, the balance of payments crisis, Indira Gandhi's surrender to the ideas of the IMF and the World Bank, the nationalization of banks, which was seen as a progressive initiative, but also was essentially a measure that solidified the control of the bureaucracy, which the licensing permit Raj had done. And many people think, I find a lot of young people, when they ask me, they think license permit control Raj was a contribution of Jawaharlal Nehru. It was not. It was a contribution of Indira Gandhi. So the 60s was really the decade of the license permit control Raj, of takeover of banking by a political class in the name of, protecting the interests of farmers and taking away the financial power from big business. But essentially, it was the aggrandizement of economic power by a ruling class in Delhi that ultimately culminates in the emergency of 74. So this centralization of power that was happening is something that I believe Professor Raj was trying to understand in his own way, that why has this happened? When he wrote the essay on the intermediate regimes, he saw it essentially as a battle between the earlier leadership of the national movement, the middle classes, and the bureaucracy that had come to take charge of the Indian state, and the political class that had come to control the bureaucracy. Don't forget, 69 AICC convention was when Indira Gandhi enunciated the principle of committed bureaucracy, demanding compliance with the party in power on the part of the civil service and the armed forces. What we now see happening under Modi, the first experiment was done by Indira Gandhi. So there was a unhappiness with this transition. And Professor Raj, in my judgment, tried to analyze changing political economy of India through this Kale Memorial lecture. Now, one other development was the complete surrender of Mrs. Gandhi to the Kulak class by the rejection of the Raj Committee on Agricultural, on taxation of agricultural holdings in 1969, right? 1971. I remember that report was, in a sense, the late, the declining period of the influence of the CPI on Mrs. Gandhi, because it was the CPI that was driving her into pushing for land reform. So she was still committed to land reform. Nandini Satpathy in Orissa, P.V. Narasimha Rao in Andhra Pradesh, chief ministers were actually taking the party leadership seriously and trying to implement land reform. There were attempts at taxation of agricultural income, but the Kulak class hit back. And if you read Narasimha Rao's fictionalized biography, The Insider, there are large sections where he's making the point that he thought he was implementing land reform sincerely because the party leader wanted it. But when he was ousted from power, he discovered that they didn't want it. They were only mouthing slogans, but they were not in favor of land reforms. And that brought to Professor Raj the power of the kulaks, the rich peasantry. So it's not simply the landlord class that was powerful, the rich peasantry was asserting its power. And of course, this is around a little later that Ashok Mitra wrote his book on terms of trade and class relations, which in a sense reiterated the argument. And then you have Susan and Lloyd Rudolph's book about bullock capitalists, etc. All of these arguments were emphasizing the power of the farm, of the rich peasants. So here was a transition happening in terms of the power play, where the kind of development orientation that Professor Raj thought was the focus of planning was no longer the focus of governance. It is a misreading of all of this, and the doctrinaire kind of response of EMS Namboodiripad that made him write a purely ideological piece in EPW criticizing Raj. If you read EMS, it's virtually taken from the party kind of textbooks, and he's throwing the party line at Professor Raj. But I think EMS did not really grasp the import of what Professor Raj was trying to say. And if you look at subsequent policies, even of the left, particularly in Bengal and even in Kerala, you realize that they are also moving in the same direction. I recall a long conversation in February 1990, in Calcutta with Jyoti Basu. When we talked about this, and I recall Jyoti Babu telling me that, look, I mean, we are no longer in the business of communist revolution. We are now defending the bourgeois revolution, because it is bourgeois democracy that is under threat. He was the first person who said, when I said to him, sir, why don't you say it in public? He said, no, the party will not accept this. But that is precisely where we are today. The defense of bourgeois democracy has become the platform of all liberal political parties. Anyway, that's really moving away from what I'm trying to say. What I'm really trying to argue in this brief note is to suggest that this particular essay of Professor Raj came at a particular point of time, and I'll end by quoting the conclusion, where he realizes at the very end of his paper that already the country is moving well beyond that stage which it had reached in the 60s, when he says, and I quote, this is a quote from Kale Memorial Lecture, intermediate regimes would face a problem finding reasonably dependable solutions for generating the surpluses needed for sustained economic growth. The public sector has served some limited purpose, but on account of the class composition of these regimes and their inability to enforce policies that can generate surpluses, not only is the growth of state capitalism itself blunted, but it helps more to promote the development of private capitalism. Once the forces of private capitalism gain strength, the bureaucratic and military apparatus of the state may well be used, like the instrument of state capitalism, to shift the balance of power further in their favor. So the kind of transition that even EMS suggests in his paper, Raj also was saying the same thing, that this is a phase, in the 60s we see an attempt to empower certain sections of society, particularly the bureaucracy. State capitalism was essentially a transitional phase in which a newly liberated post-colonial nation was establishing itself, and the bureaucracy and the political class that was in power took charge of that and was trying to enable a transition that failed. And once that transition failed, traditional kind of class forces took charge. India moved increasingly in the direction of a capitalist system, and particularly after 1991, the transition was complete. In passing, I also refer to some of the essays that I put together in a book that I published a few years back on the Bombay Plan, where I had Amal Sanyal, Meghnad Desai, and Omkar Goswami and myself analyze the Bombay Plan to make the point that here was an alternative vision in the 40s, right? You had the Nehruvian vision, but you had the Bombay Plan. And in many ways, the transition that actually finally happens is the transition that the Bombay Plan envisaged. I don't have time today to elaborate that, but if you read our book, it's titled The Bombay Plan, published about 3 or 4 years ago, we show there that the kind of transition that we finally see in India, particularly after 91, was not the transition that the Nehruvians and the Nehruvian intellectuals like Professor Raj imagined would happen in a new India, but it's the kind of transition that the authors of the Bombay Plan had imagined. And that's the conclusion of my argument. Thank you very much.
I request Dr. Ram Manohar Reddy to make his presentation.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. It's been a long day, and I don't envy Devika, who's going to come after me, be the last speaker, and she's going to speak about that fantastic souvenir that she's put together. So I'll be very brief. A number of people have also spoken about, given their reminiscences. To some extent, mine are similar to theirs. So very briefly, I will speak one about me as a student of Professor Raj, and second about Raj and Economic Weekly, and then EPW. As a student of Raj, in some sense, Joe said he was probably the greatest of teachers. Well, the thing is, I was never taught by him. I never attended a course by him. I mean, it's a huge loss, because the year we came to do our MPhil here, 1978-79, he was away in Bangkok for a year or more. So the classes that he used to take, we never attended, our batch. I mean, subsequently he did take classes for some of the others, but by then we were into our research and didn't really take a course, so that was a loss. The other thing is, pick up on what Sanjay said earlier. In a sense, without, what's the expression, making too much of it, much of what I have become, I owe to Raj, in a sense. Not because I was a PhD student, but when in the mid-70s, after I had done my management, I realized I was going to be a useless manager. Then I worked in the Planning Commission for 2 years, got interested in economics. Where to go? That's when I heard, I can't remember now who told me, that there was K.N. Raj, we knew of him, of course, that to get away from the center of power, center of influence, Delhi, that he had set up this institute in Trivandrum as an alternative, not as an alternative power center, but as an alternative way of looking at things. And most important is alternative economic analysis. And the big thing was that that MPhil course at that time and for many years afterwards was open to people like me who had no prior formal training in economics. So in the sense that he created that environment to attract people, whatever your background was. And I said that he was away for a year, but after he came back, I can't now recall how it was that I registered for a PhD with him. But what I can recall is many people, not Jews, telling me it will be very, very difficult to work with him because until then, over 25 years, he had supervised only 3 PhD theses in Delhi. So you're taking a big risk. Well, as truth be told, eventually it was very easy working with him. Maybe to use Sanjay's terminology, this was a late Raj. He essentially let us work. I mean, Shakti Padi and I were probably his last PhD students. So the mode of working was he let us develop a proposal, he gave his comments, and then we were very much on our own. And whenever we had something to write, we would give it to him. And unlike, many supervisors, etc., he wouldn't sit on it for weeks or months, but he would give you quick comments. So I was not put through the mill as, Jose, you were not the one who warned me, some others warned me, but we were not put through the mill, but we benefited from his guidance. There was another way he was, I think Santakumar, who's not here, he talked about people of that generation working with the government to enable research, help students. In the early 80s, there were 4 of us in CDS at that time who were working on aspects of agriculture and labor. Shakti Padi, Sundari, who's not here right now, I think, TK Sundari, Mihir Shah and myself. And we were, of course, living on our PhD scholar for a fantastic amount of 400 rupees a month. So he approached NABARD for a project for 3 years to give us about 1,000 rupees or something like that, a month, which allowed us to do a lot of field work, okay? So, he was, we were just PhD students, okay? But yet he went out of his effort, he used his network. Remember, he flew from Delhi to Bombay, met the chairman of NABARD and came here and said, look, you've got your project, you've got your funds, now you can go out into the field. So the point I'm trying to make was that he took an interest in his students, he was always open, as again somebody in the morning said. These days I hear about professors giving office hours, okay? My son who's just finished university, he said, I have office hours with Professor X, Professor Y. We didn't have any such thing. We could walk into any professor's room anytime to talk about our work. And Raj was no exception. There are so many times I've gone into his room. Of course, if he had a visitor, I would wait. But otherwise, whatever he was doing, he would sit down and talk with us. So he was very much open to students. Again, something that many of the previous speakers have come. There are a couple of other things. I'll just end with 2 anecdotes. One humorous, one important, in the sense that, by the time I finished my thesis, his health was not very good. And I knew he didn't have the stamina to read whatever 40,000, 50,000 words. So 2 things I did. I approached Professor Krishnaji, asking him whether he could read the thesis and approve it, if Professor Raj approved it. Which was also a dicey thing because, last stage you go to person Y and say, X can't read it, can you look at it? Then I went to Professor Raj and I said, look, without telling him that, look, I recognize his frailty, I recognize his difficulty. Is it possible for Professor Krishnaji to read it? And will you sign it if he signs off? And without a moment's hesitation, he said yes. So I don't know how many people would do that. If he had not agreed, I would have been in a soup. I would have had to wait until he was better or he felt better. And we knew that was, although it was still only the late 80s, he was not really able to concentrate for long periods of time. The second thing was a little earlier, anecdote. I did some archival work in Nagpur. which for some complicated reason was part of the government of Madhya Pradesh archives. So I finished my work. As I was leaving the last day, they said, no, you can't take this out. This has to be approved by the state government in Bhopal. This is absurd. So I came back to Trivandrum, sat here. I remember Nagaraj went to Bhopal. I asked him, please go and ask, whether those notes can be released. No. Then I just took a chance and asked Professor Raj. And sure enough, he had such a good network. His college mate from MCC was the Chief Secretary of Madhya Pradesh. And he wrote to him, and within a week, those notes were with me. Again, it may seem like a small thing, but not many people will do that. Even if you have the connections, to write to somebody who's the chief secretary of a government saying that, look, my PhD students are stuck with your SDO or whoever, so please release them. I mean, that's the kind of person he was. And then now I'll speak very briefly about Raj and Economic Weekly and EPW. We're talking about nation building project, etc. The Economic Weekly was very much part of that nation building project. It was born in 1949, just 2 years after independence. And if you look at the pages now, you will find that a huge debate about innumerable industrial policy, land reforms, deficits, etc. All those things that preoccupied the government at that time in the early 50s can be found in the Economic Weekly. And the editor, Sachin Chaudhary, was able to attract talent. And Raj was one of them. And it was not just a writer. Raj himself used to get people to write in the Economic Weekly. And then finally, when Economic Weekly collapsed in 1965, because of various reasons that needn't bother us here, but essentially lack of finance, Raj was one of those handful of people who led a group of economists, sociologists, and said, look, we can't do without such a journal. We have to have it reborn. And they put together some money, collected some money, and started the Economic and Political Weekly. And the legend is that it was Raj who said, again, it coincides with a time when he was disappointed with technocratic economic planning, to have political in the title, that Economic and Political Weekly, and that's how it was born. That I can't say if it wasn't for Raj, we wouldn't have EPW, but certainly he was an important pillar who behind the launch of EPW because of the recognition of the work that the Economic Weekly had done. And there's one other thing. It was a student of Raj in the early 60s who he recommended to Sachin Chaudhary as an assistant editor, who later became the legendary editor of EPW for 35 years, and that was Krishna Raj. That Sachin Chaudhary asked Raj, did you have any student to recommend? And I believe he recommended Krishna Raj, who moved from Delhi to Bombay and worked with him in Economic Weekly and then set up, he didn't set up EPW, but he was the one who really consolidated it and helped it grow. So in a sense, it was not just institutions of learning like Delhi School or CDS that he was involved in and contributed so much. He was also so important for the, what should I not say revival, the relaunch of the Economic Weekly in a different form, and EPW, which has given so much to so many people. By the time I became editor of EPW in 2004, he recognized that I was there. I think silently he was appreciative of the fact that a student of his had become the editor. A second student of his had become the editor of EPW. But we never really got a chance to talk about it. And the few times I met him after that were really, we're talking about general things around us. But I do like to believe that he was proud of the fact that two students of his were, editors of the EPW. I just like to end by thanking Veeramani and Professor Sudhito Mandal for this seminar, not for inviting me, but it is important to have institutional memories of those who are behind a project, those who are behind an institution. In our country, you know, very quickly we forget those who are the founders other than a plaque. So conferences like this and perhaps books that will emerge from conferences like this are very important, not only to remember the people who set it up, but also to remember the processes that underlie the establishment and growth of such institutions. I'm not sure if other institutions that Raj was associated with have, you know, shown, if I can put it strongly, shown the same kind of respect. But I'm very happy that CDS has done so this year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reddy. And also I wanted to thank our main speaker, Dr. Baru. Now I'd like to ask Professor Devika to make her comments.
Yeah, I've been asked to discuss the K.N. Raj at 100 souvenir. You probably have this already with you, so I will not go on and on about its contents. I want to take this occasion to thank all of you who have actually made this possible. A lot of the photographs that we have in this souvenir were contributed by Gopal as well as many others in this audience. I really want to thank all of you and to express our regret, I mean on behalf of the Souvenir Committee, that we have not been able to place all the captions. I only wish we were able to give adequate captions to all the photographs to identify the people in the photographs who are, you know, who you see along with Raj. That would have made the souvenir a proper archive. That unfortunately we had neither the time nor the resources to actually, you know, do that very painstaking work. So I mean, I apologize for that. As for the core of the souvenir, as you might have already noticed, the core of the souvenir consists of the memories, observations, reflections that you all members of the alumni have shared, mostly members of the alumni, but also his friends like Professor Krishna and others have shared, Professor Oman also, who have shared about Dr. Raj. Those form the core of the souvenir. But what we did was not to mechanically collate the messages that you all sent in because they were not of even length. There was a lot of repetition of detail. So what was really heartwarming is that everyone had a really interesting observation to make about Raj, one thing or the other. So what we did was to extract those observations, comments, memories, and kind of place them in separate sections which flow into each other. They are not divided you know, in a very hard and fast kind of, they kind of flow into each other on different aspects of Raj's personality. So from Raj the citizen, Raj the reader, Raj the research mentor, the policy architect, the economist, and so on. That's the core of this souvenir, and thank you very much. All the contributors have been acknowledged, and thank you very much for that. Then I think the whatever contribution of the souvenir committee comes, I think, in the design of the souvenir. We worked with a very, very talented collage artist. His name is Priyaranjan Lal. I thank him in his absence. So Priyan understood exactly what we wanted. For example, in the cover, this cover design, I told him that we wanted three things. One, Raj's presence as the person who facilitated the creation of such a beautiful space, CDS. His something that reminds us of his live presence, and some kind of a hint of Raj as the institution builder. So in this cover, you can see the color, this is actually a brick. This is basically, he's worked on a photograph of a brick. And that brick definitely is reminiscent of the space that CDS is. And this mark, of a stamp, it's a stamp, Raj at 100, definitely, there, in a very subtle and unobtrusive way, he's brought in Raj as an institution builder, with a stamp. And finally, this is Raj's signature that you see. And when in the original design, I asked the designer if the signature could be made to look like as if it had just been done with the ink wet. So that, it would look as if he had just signed. And in fact, if you look closely at the cover, that's what it looks like. The signature, the print is such that it looks like the ink is wet. So, and of course, if you look at the internal, we're very, very careful not to make this a hagiography, So we didn't want Raj to be canonized into the saint of development, Saint Raj of development or something like that. He would have hated it, that was not his spirit. So we made very sure that critical voices would be included. So there are some critical voices, people who actually, as students, entered into some kind of conflict, which of course they resolved later, but definitely, not just voices of praise, but also voices of criticism, and criticism coming in from both loving and a little bit non-loving sources as well. Without that, the souvenir would not be true to Raj. So that's there. And then finally, I want to mention, we have a small short section of CDS after Raj. So what are the different things that we have done at CDS after Raj? What are the new things, new structures that have come up, the new kinds of initiatives, etc., etc. That's one short section. There are two committees, however, which we omitted to mention because they were either Supreme Court mandated or UGC mandated. But I want to mention them here because they are so important. Because the SC/ST cell in CDS, for example, has been functioning since some years now. It is, of course, UGC mandated, not unique to CDS. Many other universities in Kerala also have it. But I think what is unique about our SC/ST cell is the kind of extremely exciting interventions that the cell has been making into both academic life at CDS as well as serious interventions in our governance, which are very valuable and are going to, and the fruit of which lies in the future, really. The SC/ST cell actually organizes many interesting seminars, so the cutting edge of research on caste, which we have been discussing this has been brought to CDS actually by the hard work of my colleagues in the SC/ST cell, especially Professor Tyagu Ranganathan, I don't find him here, and Professor Abhilash, both who have been working very hard. And of course, the wonderful students who have been working with them, to organize many different exciting events. The other committee which I really want to put my finger on is something that we have worked very, very hard on, my colleague Praveena and me and others. This is the Internal Complaints Committee. Of course, Supreme Court mandated, so therefore not unique to CDS, but the only committee perhaps of this kind that actually functions in Kerala. There are many institutions in Kerala don't have this committee at all, and where they are, they serve the interests of the privileged. In CDS, I'm really proud to tell you that we have empowered our women on campus, not just as students, but also research assistants and others, to speak up against all forms of gendered injustice and disrespect, and they do. We have also, encouraged the men on campus to be more self-reflexive about their privilege, and, to make gender relations on campus more equal. I must say, yes, and we have not flinched when there have been complaints against seniors, powerful men. I will not say that we have always been very successful at thwarting the bro culture, which is rampant
all over academia, and so CDS is no exception to that. But I want to promise you that institutional memory will not be shot on this. We have made mistakes in the sense we have missed, some important occasions to intervene, but it will not happen in the future. And all I want to say that these two committees, the SEST cell and the Internal Complaints Committee, are actually extending Raj's vision of academia as not just a liberal, but also a democratic space. And I want to conclude by saying that the only true love is critical love. No other love is true love. True love will always be critical. So many of us practice towards CDS that kind of critical love, which I think Dr. Raj would have appreciated deeply. And thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed, you take back this souvenir and it will find a place in your bookshelves. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Devika and all the other speakers, Dr. Baru and Dr. Reddy, Ramon Reddy. Fortunately, we have managed to cover the time quickly. We still have a little bit of time left for question and answer. So I think you can ask questions to everybody, but my recommendation would be that we sort of let questions about Dr. Baru's presentation. If you have questions about that, then let's have those first. And then, of course, we'll open it up for any other kinds of questions. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Sanjay, I had a question for you. Around the time that Raj was formulating and writing on his idea of the intermediate regime, if you remember, I think it was Hamza Alvi, who, the Pakistani sociologist, who wrote about the autonomy of the bureaucracy in post-colonial states. You think of both together, and what happened? I mean, in a sense, that was also implicit in Raj's idea that you got this intermediate regime in the sense that this middle class bureaucracy, what is known as nomenclatura in the Soviet context, was emerging. But from what you were saying, and this later Raj as a part of a period when that had got suppressed, and your, the original Bombay plan replaced the Nehruvian plan. So what are your thoughts on that?
See, I'll do a little bit of PR, commercial break. I have a book out a couple of years back titled India's Power Elite, in which I've explored this particular issue, where I look at the change in the role of the civil service, the role of the bureaucracy in the power system. We inherited the bureaucracy from the British, and the British empowered the bureaucracy because basically India was run by the civil service of the British. So a lot of the traditions of that civil service continued. I mean, Sardar Patel famously quoted one of his predecessors when he said, the IAS is steel frame. So the idea of the civil service being the steel frame was very much the thinking of the political leadership in the 50s. But what happens within that civil service is increasing corruption, which the license permit control Raj enables. And therefore, state capitalism as a system is the product of the corruption of that bureaucracy. Because the state becomes then, in the name of socialism, in the name of the public sector, you actually acquire control over assets. And then the political class uses their control over the bureaucracy. And Indira Gandhi's famous call for a committed bureaucracy at the AICC in '69. So you have the emergence of a state capitalist system, which is what Kelesky was looking at, which is what Charles Bettelheim was looking at. And the assumption, if you read both Kelesky and Bettelheim, both of them looked at state capitalism as a transitory system. In fact, Bettelheim more than Kelesky. Kelesky looked at it more as a paradigm, while Bettelheim looked at it more as a transitional thing. And I think in Professor Raj's essay, there's a bit of a confusion. Is it transitional or is it a paradigm? But the quote I read out at the very end, the last paragraph of his essay, he actually says it's a transitional system, right? So when you see it as a transitional system, what is it transiting to? It is transiting to classical, capitalist system. So that is why I say that, I don't think EMS properly understood what Raj was saying. And the transition that happens very gradually in the 80s, it's not yet as visible in the 70s, though you recall that many analysts of the emergency, in fact, argue that the emergency was the first step of the Indian capitalist class to take over the state. They saw the emergency as, in fact, an instrument of capitalist assertion. But there's some debate on that. But certainly in the 80s, with increasing liberalization, and after 91, you have the beginning of privatization, the privatization of banking, the growth of what the Bombay Plan envisaged as the transition to a regular capitalist system. And I think the bureaucracy went along with this, because by that time the bureaucracy, you see, becomes a part of the capitalist system. And you look at the number of civil servants, and I name them in my book, who become directors of companies. And today, every retired IAS officer and foreign service diplomat, straight away go into company boards. So this integration of the civil service with private business is becoming complete.
Any other questions? Yeah.
It is a very much a related question. We always thought the inequality that is India is witnessing now is phenomenal, and it has happened recently. But your presentation and argument shows that it is a very long process since the 70s. And but what I could understand is the corruption at the bureaucratic level that has led to the demise of the socialistic path. Do you agree with that view? Corruption at the socialistic path was progressing. Nehruvian thoughts were what you call is at attack now because of the corruption of the bureaucracy. Do you agree with that view?
I think the mistake a lot of us make is to confuse the license permit Raj with Nehruvian policy. It was not. The first plan, second plan period was not a period of bureaucratic capitalism. You really see the emergence of license permit control, Raj, in the 60s, much more during Indira Gandhi's time. The parting of ways between big business and the Congress party happened in the early 60s when J.R.D. Tata funded Swatantra Party and Rajagopalachari led the Swatantra Party, right? So it's in the early 60s that the Congress Party and the big business part company. In the 50s, Nehru did a lot of things which the big business, in fact, if you look at the Bombay Plan and the first plan, second plan, they are identical documents, virtually identical documents. That's what we have analyzed in our book, which I referred to, which Meghnad and I edited. The first and second plan is virtually like the Bombay Plan. The parting of ways is in the 60s. And by the time we come to the end of the 60s, we have an extremely corrupt and inept regime in office, which is why finally in 73 or 75 you have to impose an emergency to bring the system under some kind of control, right? You had the Nav Nirman movement, the students' agitation, the railway strike. I mean, the early 70s, when we were students, that was a period of a revolution in this country. There were strikes all over the country, right? Working class movements, student movements, agrarian movements. So you had a period of great dissatisfaction, followed by some stability, but a stability that finally evolved into what I would call classic capitalist system. which is what we now have, where the big business runs the country. And we have seen an extreme form of that in the last decade, with the overgrowth of these two big families. But essentially, big business now controls the political system. I mean, you see the whole electoral bonds controversy, etc. So this is where this whole process has arrived at.
Any other questions? Raman Mahadevan?
Sanjay, the license permits, Raj, that you talked about, the draconian form might have emerged in the 60s, but even in the 50s, from what I could gather, there was some kind of a control over licenses to be issued in Delhi, and business houses had to come to Chennai, and the Tamil capital, for instance, the major grouse that they had, that they had to traverse 2,500 kilometers to come to Delhi and lobby with, and they were very influential, powerful bureaucrats, largely Tamilian, the industry finance department controlled by Tamil ICS bureaucrats. And they had to come and lobby for there. But the Marwadis were already there. They had set up their offices. So there was a lot of lobbying going on, even in the 50s. Foreign exchange was scarce because we didn't have a capital goods industry. So machinery had to be imported from outside. And there was only so much of foreign exchange that could be made available to n number of capitalists from east, west, and south. So there was some form of capital control even during the Nehruvian phase, but possibly by the 60s it assumed a much more draconian sort of form.
No, you're right. I mean, it's not as if they were, after all, the controls came during the war. They were wartime controls, essentially, right? And in many areas, those wartime controls continued. But the logic of that period was one of scarcity. And controls were seen as a way of, managing scarcity, not as a means of, concentrating power. The consequence of that control system, which was meant to manage scarcity, results in the concentration of power in those who are managing that scarcity. The Mundra case was one of the earliest cases, right? But they were stray cases. It was not, you look at the Hazari Committee report. There are two reports, right? The ILPIC, Industrial Licensing Policy Inquiry Committee report, Subimal Dutt Committee report, the Hazari Committee report. All those reports show a intensification of the process in the 60s, right? When, and then cornering by a few groups. Basically, the division within big business starts with Tata, JRD Tata complaining that everything is going to GD Birla. And if you look at the records of FICCI, I had the opportunity to look at some of them when I was with them. FICCI was 100% with the Congress party, funding the Congress party. We were very happy with the controls. The Birlas and the Singhanias and the Thappars had no problem with the controls because they were beneficiaries. It's the Tatas who are objecting. And that is why JRD funded Swatantra Party and moved away. But by the time you come to the 90s, the decontrol, delicensing that happens in 91, the entire Marwadi business is wiped out. It's wiped out. You just look at the top 100 companies, that is when all the new businesses rise. So in a sense, the transition happens. But I think the reassertion of big business, which has happened in the last 20 years, is really last 20 years with the consolidation of both the Ambanis and the Adanis and a couple of other businesses. That's a more recent phenomenon. But that's the phenomenon that has now contributed to the kind of power system that we are dealing with.
Any other question?
It's not a question at all. It's just about a point about an aside about the souvenir committee.
Oh no, that we can come to a little later. I'll leave a little time.
Yeah,
because I had one comment on Sanjay's thing. Basically, to come back to Raj, it's not correct, I think, to conflate the whole intermediate regime issue into the takeover of the bureaucracy. Raj's concern was about the ability of the middle class to survive, aware of its split. Essentially the professional classes. So these are the people that ran the whole system. It is their loss of power. Of course, the bureaucracy was a very important part of it and may have been the cause of their ending, but I think the basic issue is whether or not, and I think it's relevant even today, as to what is the political future of the middle class. Because they're a little out of it, haven't quite given up. People, all the professional classes, all the everybody, but it's become split. So that's one thing. If you look at the issue today, that's something to consider about what would Raj have thought about what's happening to the middle class itself, knowing that it's split, and is it a relevant thing to talk about? The second issue in Raj's, the paper that, both papers, Raj kept hinting at one thing. He was asking the question as to under what circumstances can this whole developmental project of Nehruism, which means bringing development to the poor, somehow uplifting poverty, etc., under what circumstances can they get political support? And there he made two comments. One comment I thought was at that time quite perspicacious. He said that it is very, very important not to let foreign capital in. And I think he foresaw that very early, because if you look at 1991, the most significant thing is actually the fact that you opened the door to foreign capital. This whole globalization. So this is an important issue. It is not purely a story of domestic capitalists. One domestic capitalist group displacing the other. It is what is the significance of opening it up to foreign capital, foreign investment. That's another angle that I thought Raj said. The other angle that Raj mentioned over there was a third thing. He said the conditions under which the middle class is going to be able to retain some semblance of political respectability is whether or not the small and medium enterprises can be rescued and this thing. If they cannot do that, then they will lose their legitimacy. So there are certain issues of the loss of legitimacy of the middle class's ideology and politics that is sort of implicit in that Raj's thing, and I wonder if you'd like to comment on it.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, some of it is in the paper which I've written. See, as far as my argument about the bureaucracy is that the bureaucracy was the instrument of the middle class. Because how does the middle class exercise its power? It does not have representational power in parliament, which is what it had in the Constituent Assembly. Yeah? By the time you have elections, 57 general elections, 62 general elections, the peasantry has taken over the legislative system. And that is there even in Raj's essays. Which is why the failure of land reforms, which is why the inability to tax agricultural income, the legislatures are taken over by landed interests, right? Small industry is protected through the instruments of the bureaucracy. It's bureaucratic intervention that protects small industry. They have no other form of protection. And the nationalization of banks enables some access to finance for both peasants and small capital, but the nationalized banks are controlled by the bureaucracy. So the bureaucracy was the instrument through which the middle class exercised its power. And today that's no longer the case because the bureaucracy has either been corrupted or completely bought over by big business.
Anyway, now we'll open it up for general questions. I know some people wanted to ask questions about the souvenir or any other issue that you want to discuss with with Dr. Ram Manohar Reddy or Dr. Devika.
No, if I may, I'm just wondering, the photographs certainly add enormous value to the souvenir. But also, photograph without titles leaves one high and dry. So I was wondering, between tomorrow and day after, it's possible to print out in a sheet of paper and we can get them pasted at the back of the, we can go to a counter where we'll get the sheet of paper so that we can staple it or paste it at the end of the souvenir, which says page number 44. this is the photograph, page number, whatever. There are some photographs on which titles do appear, but others which potentially are very, very interesting, but which do not carry the title. Is it possible? Just a suggestion. Thank you.
This is very heavy labor. That's a lot of work. I don't think it can be done in a day at all. We'll have to sit with different people. Hopefully, Gopal can help us a little bit. And then maybe the old albums will have some, notes, no? So then that is very hard work. But, well, if we devote time to it, on the website we have a low resolution version, soft copy. So if we manage to do that, depends on, of course, Veeramani takes the final call on that, how much time we can do on. If we do, then maybe we can add it to as maybe an index page or something for the photographs with as much detail we can muster. That can be perhaps added to the soft version on the website. We will try to do that. We'll have a discussion on that later and see if it can be done. Thank you very much for that suggestion.
Any other comments or questions? It's been a long day, but an exciting day and a wonderful day. I don't want to bring it to a close. It's been so exciting, but I know you must be hungry. We'll wait. Is there any other comment? Ram's reminiscences, for example. Any questions? Yeah.
Comment, actually.
Yeah, comment.
The souvenir. I just skipped through the souvenir, and I thought a lot of work has gone into it, because really, sort of categorizing it into different dimensions, Raj is a teacher, Raj is so, all that, I think that was very well done. And so kudos to the team who had done all this work. I wanted to say that.
Thanks a lot. And
thanks a lot, yeah, Mridul,
with
thanks.
that, I think we shall bring it to a close. You want to say anything before we close? We'll
Hello,
close
sir.
this session. Yeah,
One
go ahead.
small announcement.
Yeah, please.
We welcome Sudha Ramalingam to share her new book, about her new book. Sudha Ramalingam.
Not Mahalingam.
This is, unexpected commercial break again. The book comes into play basically because there is going to be a chapter on my life in CDS. It's certainly worm's eye view. It's not scholarly book. It will be tongue-in-cheek, light-hearted, but there will be a chapter from a woman student's life in CDS in the 1980s. This book is on India's liberalization journey as seen from my perspective in various positions, because my career coincided with the liberalization journey, although CDS stint predates it, but it will feature as a chapter in the book. It's going to be published by Westland maybe early next year.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am, and thank you for, sorry for the mistake, ma'am. Sudha Mahalingam, ma'am.
So I thank our panelists and close the session.
Another thing I wanted to say, one suggestion from Professor K.L. Krishnan sir about our time management. On behalf of our organization,